Vladimir Lenin, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. Written April to May 1920. First published as a pamphlet in June 1920. Chapter 1. In what sense can we speak of the international significance of the Russian Revolution? In the first months after the proletariat in Russia had won political power, October 25th, November 7th in the new calendar style, 1917, it might have seemed that the enormous difference between backward Russia and the advanced countries of Western Europe would lead to the proletarian revolution in the latter countries bearing very little resemblance to ours. We now possess quite considerable international experience, which shows very definitely that certain fundamental features of our revolution have a significance that is not local or peculiarly national or Russian alone, but international. I am not speaking here of international significance in the broad sense of the term. Not merely several, but all the primary features of our revolution, and many of its secondary features, are of international significance in the meaning of its effect on all countries. I am speaking of it in the narrowest sense of the word, taking international significance to mean the international validity or the historical inevitability of a repetition on an international scale of what has taken place in our country. It must be admitted that certain fundamental features of our revolution do possess that significance. It would, of course, be grossly erroneous to exaggerate this truth and to extend it beyond certain fundamental features of our revolution. It would also be erroneous to lose sight of the fact that, soon after the victory of the proletarian revolution in at least one of the advanced countries, a sharp change will probably come about. Russia will cease to be the model and will once again become a backward country, in the Soviet and the socialist sense. At the present moment in history, however, it is the Russian model that reveals to all countries something, and something highly significant, of their near and inevitable future. Advanced workers in all lands have long realized this. More often than not, they have grasped it with their revolutionary class instinct rather than realized it. Herein lies the international significance, in the narrow sense of the word, of Soviet power, and of the fundamentals of Bolshevik theory and tactics. The quote-unquote revolutionary leaders of the Second International, such as Kautsky in Germany, and Otto Bauer and Friedrich Adler in Austria, have failed to understand this, which is why they have proved to be reactionaries and advocates of the worst kind of opportunism and social treachery. Incidentally, the anonymous pamphlet entitled The World Revolution, Weltrevolution, which appeared in Vienna in 1919, Sozialistische Bücherei, Heft 11, very clearly reveals their entire thinking and their range of ideas, or rather, the full extent of their stupidity, pedantry, baseness, and betrayal of working-class interests, and that, moreover, under the guise of quote-unquote defending the idea of quote-unquote world revolution. We shall, however, deal with this pamphlet in greater detail some other time. We shall here note only one more point. In bygone days, when he was still a Marxist and not a renegade, Kautsky, dealing with the question as an historian, foresaw the possibility of a situation arising in which the revolutionary spirit of the Russian proletariat would provide a model to Western Europe. This was in 1902, when Kautsky wrote an article for the revolutionary Iskra, entitled The Slavs and Revolution. Here is what he wrote in that article. Quote, "At the present time, it would seem that not only have the Slavs entered the ranks of the revolutionary nations, but that the center of revolutionary thought and revolutionary action is shifting more and more to the Slavs. The revolutionary center is shifting from the west to the east. In the first half of the 19th century, it was located in France, at times in England. In 1848, Germany too joined the ranks of the revolutionary nations. The new century has begun with events which suggest the idea that we are approaching a further shift of the revolutionary center, namely to Russia. Russia, which has borrowed so much revolutionary initiative from the West, is now perhaps herself ready to serve the West as a source of revolutionary energy. The Russian revolutionary movement that is now flaring up will perhaps prove to be the most potent means of exercising the spirit of flabby Philistinism and coldly calculating politics that is beginning to spread in our midst, and it may cause the fighting spirit and the passionate devotion to our great ideals to flare up again. To Western Europe, Russia has long ceased to be a bulwark of reaction and absolutism. I think the reverse is true today. Western Europe is becoming Russia's bulwark of reaction and absolutism. The Russian revolutionaries might perhaps have coped with the Tsar long ago had they not been compelled at the same time to fight his ally, European capital. Let us hope that this time they will succeed in coping with both enemies, and that the new Holy Alliance will collapse more rapidly than its predecessor did. However the present struggle in Russia may end, the blood and suffering of the martyrs whom, unfortunately, it will produce into great numbers, will not have been in vain. They will nourish the shoots of social revolution throughout the civilized world, and make them grow more luxuriantly and rapidly. In 1848, the Slavs were a killing frost, which blighted the flowers of the people's spring. Perhaps they are now destined to be the storm that will break the ice of reaction, and irresistibly bring with it a new and happy spring for the nations." Unquote. Karl Kautsky, The Slavs and Revolution, Iskra, Russian Social Democratic Revolutionary Newspaper, number 18, March 10th, 1902. How well Karl Kautsky wrote 18 years ago. Footnote. The Old Iskra, the first illegal Marxist newspaper in Russia. It was founded by V.I. Lenin in 1900, and played a decisive role in the formation of a revolutionary Marxist party of the working class in Russia. Iskra's first issue appeared in Leipzig in December 1900, the following issues being brought out in Munich, and then beginning with July 1902 in London, and after the spring of 1903 in Geneva. On Lenin's initiative and with his participation, the editorial staff drew up a draft of the party's program, published in Iskra number 21, and prepared the Second Congress of the RSDLP, at which the Russian Revolutionary Marxist Party was actually founded. Soon after the Second Congress, the Mensheviks, supported by Plekhanov, won control of Iskra. Beginning with issue number 52, Iskra ceased to be an organ of the revolutionary Marxists. Chapter 2. An essential condition of the Bolshevik success. It is, I think, almost universally realized at present that the Bolsheviks could not have retained power for 2.5 months, let alone 2.5 years, without the most rigorous and truly iron discipline in our party, or without the fullest and unreserved support from the entire mass of the working class, that is, from all the thinking, honest, devoted, and influential elements in it, capable of leading the backward strata or carrying the ladder along with them. The dictatorship of the proletariat means a most determined and most ruthless war waged by the new class against the more powerful enemy, the bourgeoisie, whose resistance is increased tenfold by their overthrow, even if only in a single country, and whose power lies not only in the strength of international capital, the strength and durability of their international connections, but also in the force of habit, in the strength of small-scale production. Unfortunately, small-scale production is still widespread in the world, and small-scale production engenders capitalism and the bourgeoisie continuously, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale. All these reasons make the dictatorship of the proletariat necessary, and victory over the bourgeoisie is impossible without a long, stubborn, and desperate life-and-death struggle, which calls for tenacity, discipline, and a single and inflexible will. I repeat, the experience of the victorious dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia has clearly shown, even to those who are incapable of thinking, or have had no occasion to give thought to the matter, that absolute centralization and rigorous discipline of the proletariat are an essential condition of victory over the bourgeoisie. This is often dwelt on. However, not nearly enough thought is given to what it means, and under what conditions it is possible. Would it not be better if the salutations addressed to the Soviets and the Bolsheviks were more frequently accompanied by a profound analysis of the reasons why the Bolsheviks had been able to build up the discipline needed by the revolutionary proletariat. As a current of political thought and as a political party, Bolshevism has existed since 1903. Only the history of Bolshevism during the entire period of its existence can satisfactorily explain why it has been able to build up and maintain, under most difficult conditions, the iron discipline needed for the victory of the proletariat. The first questions to arise are: how is the discipline of the proletariat's revolutionary party maintained? How is it tested? How is it reinforced? First, by the class consciousness of the proletarian vanguard, and by its devotion to the revolution, by its tenacity, self-sacrifice, and heroism. Second, by its ability to link up, maintain the closest contact, and, if you wish, merge in certain measure with the broadest masses of the working people, primarily with the proletariat, but also with the non-proletarian masses of the working people. Third, by the correctness of the political leadership exercised by this vanguard, by the correctness of its political strategy and tactics, provided the broad masses have seen, from their own experience, that they are correct. Without these conditions, discipline in a revolutionary party, really capable of being the party of the advanced class, whose mission it is to overthrow the bourgeoisie and transform the whole of society, cannot be achieved. Without these conditions, all attempts to establish discipline inevitably fall flat and end up in phrasemongering and clowning. On the other hand, these conditions cannot emerge at once. They are created only by prolonged effort and hard-won experience. Their creation is facilitated by a correct revolutionary theory, which in its turn is not a dogma, but assumes final shape only in close connection with the practical activity of a truly mass and truly revolutionary movement. The fact that in 1917 to 1920, Bolshevism was able, under unprecedentedly difficult conditions, to build up and successfully maintain the strictest centralization and iron discipline was due simply to a number of historical peculiarities of Russia. On the one hand, Bolshevism arose in 1903 on a very firm foundation of Marxist theory. The correctness of this revolutionary theory, and of it alone, has been proved, not only by world experience throughout the 19th century, but especially by the experience of the seekings and vacillations, the errors and disappointments of revolutionary thought in Russia. For about half a century, approximately from the 40s to the 90s of the last century, progressive thought in Russia, oppressed by a most brutal and reactionary Tsarism, sought eagerly for a correct revolutionary theory, and followed with the utmost diligence and thoroughness each and every quote-unquote last word in this sphere in Europe and America. Russia achieved Marxism, the only correct revolutionary theory, through the agony she experienced in the course of half a century of unparalleled torment and sacrifice, of unparalleled revolutionary heroism, incredible energy, devoted searching, study, practical trial, disappointment, verification and comparison with European experience. Thanks to the political emigration caused by Tsarism, revolutionary Russia in the second half of the 19th century acquired a wealth of international links and excellent information on the forms and theories of the world revolutionary movement, such as no other country possessed. On the other hand, Bolshevism, which had arisen on this granite foundation of theory, went through 15 years of practical history, 1903 to 1917, unequaled anywhere in the world in its wealth of experience. During those 15 years, no other country knew anything even approximating to that revolutionary experience, that rapid and varied succession of different forms of the movement, legal and illegal, peaceful and stormy, underground and open, local circles and mass movements, and parliamentary and terrorist forms. In no other country has there been concentrated, in so brief a period, such a wealth of forms, shades, and methods of struggle of all classes of modern society, a struggle which, owing to the backwardness of the country and the severity of the Tsarist yoke, matured with exceptional rapidity and assimilated most eagerly and successfully the appropriate last word of American and European political experience. Chapter 3. The Principal Stages in the History of Bolshevism. The years of preparation for revolution, 1903 to 1905. The approach of a great storm was sensed everywhere. All classes were in a state of ferment and preparation. Abroad, the press of the political exiles discussed the theoretical aspects of all the fundamental problems of revolution. Representatives of the three main classes, of the three principal political trends, the liberal bourgeois, the petty bourgeois democratic, concealed behind quote-unquote social democratic and quote-unquote social revolutionary labels, and the proletarian revolutionary, anticipated and prepared the impending open class struggle by waging a most bitter struggle on issues of program and tactics. All issues on which the masses waged an armed struggle in 1905 to 1907 and 1917 to 1920 can and should be studied, in their embryonic form, in the press of the period. Among these three main trends there were, of course, a host of intermediate, transitional or half-hearted forms. It would be more correct to say that those political and ideological trends, which were genuinely of a class nature, crystallized in the struggle of press organs, parties, factions and groups. The classes were forging the requisite political and ideological weapons for the impending battles. Footnote: Petty bourgeois democratic. The reference is to the Mensheviks, who formed the right and opportunist wing of social democracy in the RSDLP, and to the socialist revolutionaries. End of footnote. The years of revolution, 1905 to 1907, all classes came out into the open. All programmatical and tactical views were tested by the action of the masses. In its extent and acuteness, the strike struggle had no parallel anywhere in the world. The economic strike developed into a political strike, and the latter into insurrection. The relations between the proletariat as the leader and the vacillating and unstable peasantry as the led were tested in practice. The Soviet form of organization came into being in the spontaneous development of the struggle. The controversies of that period over the significance of the Soviets anticipated the great struggle of 1917 to 1920. The alternation of parliamentary and non-parliamentary forms of struggle, of the tactics of boycotting parliament, and that of participating in parliament, of legal and illegal forms of struggle, and likewise their interrelations and connections, all this was marked by an extraordinary wealth of content. As for teaching the fundamentals of political science to masses and leaders, to classes and parties alike, each month of this period was equivalent to an entire year of peaceful and constitutional development. Without the dress rehearsal of 1905, the victory of the October Revolution in 1917 would have been impossible. The years of reaction, 1907 to 1910. Tsarism was victorious. All the revolutionary and opposition parties were smashed. Depression, demoralization, splits, discord, defection and pornography took the place of politics. There was an even greater drift towards philosophical idealism. Mysticism became the garb of counter-revolutionary sentiments. At the same time, however, it was this great defeat that taught the revolutionary parties and the revolutionary class a real and very useful lesson, a lesson in historical dialectics, a lesson in an understanding of the political struggle, and in the art and science of waging that struggle. It is at moments of need that one learns who one's friends are. Defeated armies learn their lesson. Victorious Tsarism was compelled to speed up the destruction of the remnants of the pre-bourgeois, patriarchal mode of life in Russia. The country's development along bourgeois lines proceeded apace. Illusions that stood outside and above class distinctions, illusions concerning the possibility of avoiding capitalism, were scattered to the winds. The class struggle manifested itself in a quite new and more distinct way. The revolutionary parties had to complete their education. They were learning how to attack. Now they had to realize that such knowledge must be supplemented with the knowledge of how to retreat in good order. They had to realize, and it is from bitter experience, that the revolutionary class learns to realize this, that victory is impossible unless one has learned how to attack and retreat properly. Of all the defeated opposition and revolutionary parties, the Bolsheviks effected the most orderly retreat, with the least loss of their army, with its core best preserved, with the least significant splits in point of depth and incurability, with the least demoralization, and in the best condition to resume work on the broadest scale, and in the most correct and energetic manner. The Bolsheviks achieved this not only because they ruthlessly exposed and expelled the revolutionary phrasemongers, those who did not wish to understand that one had to retreat, that one had to know how to retreat, and that one had absolutely to learn how to work legally in the most reactionary of parliaments, in the most reactionary of trade unions, cooperative and insurance societies, and similar organizations. The Years of Revival, 1910 to 1914. At first progress was incredibly slow. Then, following the Lenin events of 1912, it became somewhat more rapid. Overcoming unprecedented difficulties, the Bolsheviks thrust back the Mensheviks, whose role as bourgeois agents in the working class movement was clearly realized by the entire bourgeoisie after 1905, and whom the bourgeoisie therefore supported in 1,000 ways against the Bolsheviks. But the Bolsheviks would never have succeeded in doing this had they not followed the correct tactics of combining illegal work with the utilization of legal opportunities, which they made a point of doing. In the elections to the arch-reactionary Duma, the Bolsheviks won the full support of the worker curia. The First Imperialist World War, 1914 to 1917. Legal parliamentarism, with an extremely reactionary parliament, rendered most useful service to the Bolsheviks, the party of the revolutionary proletariat. The Bolshevik deputies were exiled to Siberia. Footnote. Reference is to the Bolshevik deputies to the Fourth Duma, namely A.Y. Badayev, M.K. Muranov, G.I. Petrovsky, F.N. Samoilov, and N.R. Shagov. At the Duma's session of July 26th, August 8 in the new calendar style, 1914, at which all the bourgeois landowner Duma groups approved Tsarist Russia's entry into the imperialist war, the Bolshevik Duma group declared a firm protest. They refused to vote for war credits, and launched revolutionary propaganda among the people. In November 1914, the Bolshevik deputies were arrested. In February 1915, they were brought to trial and exiled for life to Turkhansk territory in eastern Siberia. The courageous speeches made by the Bolshevik deputies at their trial, exposing the autocracy, played an important part in anti-war propaganda and in revolutionizing the toiling masses. End of footnote. All shades of social imperialism, social chauvinism, social patriotism, inconsistent and consistent internationalism, pacifism and the revolutionary repudiation of pacifist illusions found full expression in the Russian émigré press. The learned fools and the old women of the Second International, who had arrogantly and contemptuously turned up their noses at the abundance of factions in the Russian socialist movement and at the bitter struggle they were waging among themselves, were unable, when the war deprived them of their vaunted legality in all advanced countries, to organize anything even approximating such a free, in brackets illegal, interchange of views and such a free, in brackets illegal, evolution of correct views as the Russian revolutionaries did in Switzerland and in a number of other countries. That was why both the avowed social patriots and the Kautskyites of all countries proved to be the worst traitors to the proletariat. One of the principal reasons why Bolshevism was able to achieve victory in 1917 to 1920 was that, since the end of 1914, it had been ruthlessly exposing the baseness and vileness of social chauvinism and Kautskyism, to which Longuetism in France, the views of the Fabians, and the leaders of the Independent Labour Party in Britain, of Turati in Italy, etc. correspond, the masses later becoming more and more convinced from their own experience of the correctness of the Bolshevik views. Footnote. Longuetism, the centrist trend within the French Socialist Party, headed by Jean Longuet, during the First World War of 1914 to 1918, the Longitists conducted a policy of conciliation with the social chauvinists. They rejected the revolutionary struggle and came out for quote-unquote defense of country in the imperialist war. Lenin called them petty bourgeois nationalists. After the victory of the October Socialist Revolution in Russia, the Longitists called themselves supporters of the proletarian dictatorship, but in fact they remained opposed to it. In December 1920, the Longitists, together with avowed reformists, broke away from the party and joined the so-called 2.5 International. Fabians, members of the Fabian Society, a British reformist organization founded in 1884. The membership consisted in the main of bourgeois intellectuals. Fabians denied the necessity of the proletariat's class struggle and the socialist revolution, and contended that the transition from capitalism to socialism was possible only through petty reforms and the gradual reorganization of society. In 1900, the Fabian Society joined the Labour Party. The Fabians are characterized by Lenin in British Pacifism and British Dislike of Theory. See Present Edition, Volume 21, pages 260 to 265, and elsewhere. End of footnote. The Second Revolution in Russia, February to October 1917. Tsarism's senility and obsoleteness had, with the aid of the blows and hardships of a most agonizing war, created an incredibly destructive force directed against it. Within a few days, Russia was transformed into a democratic bourgeois republic, freer in war conditions than any other country in the world. The leaders of the opposition and revolutionary parties began to set up a government, just as is done in the most strictly parliamentary republics. The fact that a man had been a leader of an opposition party in parliament, even in a most reactionary parliament, facilitated his subsequent role in the revolution. In a few weeks, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries thoroughly assimilated all the methods and manners, the arguments and sophistries of the European heroes of the Second International, of the ministerialists, and other opportunist riffraff. Footnote: Ministerialism, or ministerial socialism, or else Millerandism, the opportunist tactic of socialists, participation in reactionary bourgeois governments. The term appeared when in 1899 the French socialist Millerand joined the bourgeois government of Waldeck-Rousseau. End of footnote. Everything we now read about the Scheidemans and Noschkes, about Kautsky and Hilferding, Renner and Austerlitz, Otto Bauer and Fritz Adler, Torradi and Longuet, about the Fabians and the leaders of the Independent Labour Party of Britain. All this seems to us, and indeed is, a dreary repetition, a reiteration of an old and familiar refrain. We have already witnessed all this in the instance of the Mensheviks. As history would have it, the opportunists of a backward country became the forerunners of the opportunists in a number of advanced countries. If the heroes of the Second International have all gone bankrupt and have disgraced themselves over the question of the significance and role of the Soviets and Soviet rule, if the leaders of the three very important parties which have now left the Second International, namely the German Independent Social Democratic Party, the French Longitists, and the British Independent Labour Party, have disgraced themselves and become entangled in this question in a most telling fashion, if they have all shown themselves slaves to the prejudices of petty bourgeois democracy, fully in the spirit of the petty bourgeois of 1848 who called themselves Social Democrats, then we can only say that we have already witnessed all this in the instance of the Mensheviks. Footnote: The Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, a centrist party founded in April 1917. A split took place at the Congress of the Independent Social Democratic Party, held in Halle in October 1920, the majority joining the Communist Party of Germany in December 1920. The right wing formed a separate party, retaining the old name of the Independent Social Democratic Party. In 1922, the quote-unquote independents rejoined the German Social Democratic Party. End of footnote. As history would have it, the Soviets came into being in Russia in 1905. From February to October 1917, they were turned to a false use by the Mensheviks, who went bankrupt because of their inability to understand the role and significance of the Soviets. Today the idea of Soviet power has emerged throughout the world and is spreading among the proletariat of all countries with extraordinary speed. Like our Mensheviks, the old heroes of the Second International are everywhere going bankrupt, because they are incapable of understanding the role and significance of the Soviets. Experience has proved that, on certain very important questions of the proletarian revolution, all countries will inevitably have to do what Russia has done. Despite views that are today often to be met with in Europe and America, the Bolsheviks began their victorious struggle against the parliamentary and, in fact, bourgeois republic, and against the Mensheviks in a very cautious manner, and the preparations they made for it were by no means simple. At the beginning of the period mentioned, we did not call for the overthrow of the government, but explained that it was impossible to overthrow it without first changing the composition and the temper of the Soviets. We did not proclaim a boycott of the bourgeois parliament, the Constituent Assembly, but said, and following the April 1917 conference of our party, began to state officially in the name of the party that a bourgeois republic with a Constituent Assembly would be better than a bourgeois republic without a Constituent Assembly, but that a workers' and peasants' republic, a Soviet republic, would be better than any bourgeois democratic parliamentary republic. Without such thorough, circumspect, and long preparations, we could not have achieved victory in October 1917, or have consolidated that victory. Chapter 4. The struggle against which enemies within the working class movement helped Bolshevism develop, gain strength, and become steeled. First and foremost, the struggle against opportunism, which in 1914 definitely developed into social chauvinism and definitely sided with the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. Naturally, this was Bolshevism's principal enemy within the working class movement. It still remains the principal enemy on an international scale. The Bolsheviks have been devoting the greatest attention to this enemy. This aspect of Bolshevik activities is now fairly well known abroad too. It was, however, different with Bolshevism's other enemy within the working class movement. Little is known in other countries of the fact that Bolshevism took shape, developed, and became steeled in the long years of struggle against petty bourgeois revolutionism, which smacks of anarchism or borrows something from the latter, and in all essential matters does not measure up to the conditions and requirements of a consistently proletarian class struggle. Marxist theory has established, and the experience of all European revolutions and revolutionary movements has fully confirmed, that the petty proprietor, the small master, a social type existing on a very extensive and even mass scale in many European countries, who, under capitalism, always suffer oppression and very frequently a most acute and rapid deterioration in his conditions of life, and even ruin, easily goes to revolutionary extremes, but is incapable of perseverance, organization, discipline, and steadfastness. A petty bourgeois driven to frenzy by the horrors of capitalism is a social phenomenon which, like anarchism, is characteristic of all capitalist countries. The instability of such revolutionism, its barrenness, and its tendency to turn rapidly into submission, apathy, phantasms, and even a frenzied infatuation with one bourgeois fad or another, all this is common knowledge. However, a theoretical or abstract recognition of these truths does not at all rid revolutionary parties of old errors, which always crop up at unexpected occasions, in somewhat new forms, in a hitherto unfamiliar garb or surroundings, in an unusual, a more or less unusual situation. Anarchism was not infrequently a kind of penalty for the opportunist sins of the working class movement. The two monstrosities complemented each other. And if in Russia, despite the more petty bourgeois composition of her population as compared with other European countries, anarchism's influence was negligible during the two revolutions of 1905 and 1917, and the preparations for them. This should no doubt stand partly to the credit of Bolshevism, which has always waged a most ruthless and uncompromising struggle against opportunism. I say partly, since of still greater importance in weakening anarchism's influence in Russia was the circumstance that in the past, the 70s of the 19th century, it was able to develop inordinately and to reveal its absolute erroneousness, its unfitness to serve the revolutionary class as a guiding theory. When it came into being in 1903, Bolshevism took over the tradition of a ruthless struggle against petty bourgeois, semi-anarchist or dilettante anarchist revolutionism, a tradition which had always existed in revolutionary social democracy and had become particularly strong in our country during the years 1900 to 1903, when the foundations for a mass party of the revolutionary proletariat were being laid in Russia. Bolshevism took over and carried on the struggle against a party which, more than any other, expressed the tendencies of petty bourgeois revolutionism, namely the quote-unquote Socialist Revolutionary Party, and waged that struggle on three main issues. First, that party, which rejected Marxism stubbornly, refused, or it might be more correct to say, was unable to understand the need for a strictly objective appraisal of the class forces and their alignment before taking any political action. Second, this party considered itself particularly quote-unquote revolutionary or quote-unquote left because of its recognition of individual terrorism, assassination, something that we Marxists emphatically rejected. It was, of course, only on grounds of expediency that we rejected individual terrorism, whereas people who were capable of condemning quote-unquote on principle the terror of the Great Revolution, or in general the terror employed by a victorious revolutionary party, which is besieged by the bourgeoisie of the world, were ridiculed and laughed to scorn by Plekhanov in 1900 to 1903, when he was a Marxist and a revolutionary. Third, the socialist revolutionaries, quote-unquote, thought it very, quote-unquote, left to sneer at the comparatively insignificant opportunist sins of the German Social Democratic Party, while they themselves imitated the extreme opportunists of that party, for example on the agrarian question, or on the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. History, incidentally, has now confirmed on a vast and worldwide scale the opinion we have always advocated, namely that German revolutionary social democracy. Note that as far back as 1900 to 1903, Plekhanov demanded Bernstein's expulsion from the party, and in 1913 the Bolsheviks, always continuing this tradition, exposed Lenin's baseness, vileness, and treachery, came closest to being the party the revolutionary proletariat needs in order to achieve victory. Footnote. Lenin is referring probably to his article What Should Not Be Copied from the German Labor Movement, published in the Bolshevik magazine Proshevchenye in April 1914. See present edition, volume 20, pages 254 to 58. Here Lenin exposed the treacherous behavior of Karl Legien, the German Social Democrat who in 1912, in addressing the Congress of the USA, praised U.S. official circles and bourgeois parties. End of footnote. Today, in 1920, after all the ignominious failures and crises of the war period and early post-war years, it can be plainly seen that, of all the Western parties, the German Revolutionary Social Democrats produced the finest leaders and recovered and gained new strength more rapidly than the others did. This may be seen in the instances both of the Spartacists and the left proletarian wing of the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is waging an incessant struggle against the opportunism and spinelessness of the Kautskys, Hilferdings, Lederbauers, and Crispians. Footnote. The Spartacists, members of the Spartacus League, founded in January 1916 during the First World War, under the leadership of Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Franz Mehring, and Clara Zetkin. The Spartacists conducted revolutionary anti-war propaganda among the masses, and exposed the expansionist policy of German imperialism and the treachery of the social democratic leaders. However, the Spartacists, the German left wing, did not get rid of their semi-Menshevik errors on the most important questions of theory and tactics. A criticism of the German left wing's mistakes is given in Lenin's works. On Junius's pamphlet, see present edition, volume 22, pages 297 to 305, A Caricature of Marxism and Imperialist Economism. See volume 23, pages 28 to 76, and elsewhere. In April 1917, the Spartacists joined the centrist Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, preserving their organizational independence. After the November 1918 revolution in Germany, the Spartacists broke away from the independents and in December of the same year founded the Communist Party of Germany. End of footnote. If we now cast a glance to take in a complete historical period, namely from the Paris Commune to the First Socialist Soviet Republic, we shall find that Marxism's attitude to anarchism in general stands out most definitely and unmistakably. In the final analysis, Marxism proved to be correct, and although the anarchists rightly pointed to the opportunist views on the state prevalent among most of the socialist parties, it must be said first that this opportunism was connected with the distortion and even deliberate suppression of Marxist views on the state. In my book, The State and Revolution, I pointed out that for 36 years, from 1875 to 1911, Bebel withheld a letter by Engels, which very clearly, vividly, bluntly, and definitely exposed the opportunism of the current social democratic views on the state. Footnote. The reference is to Friedrich Engels' letter to August Bebel, written on March 18 to 28, 1875. End of footnote. Second, that the rectification of these opportunist views and the recognition of Soviet power and its superiority to bourgeois parliamentary democracy proceeded most rapidly and extensively among those trends in the socialist parties of Europe and America that were most Marxist. The struggle that Bolshevism waged against quote-unquote left deviations within its own party assumed particularly large proportions on two occasions. In 1908, on the question of whether or not to participate in the most reactionary parliament, and in the legal workers' societies, which were being restricted by most reactionary laws, and again in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, on the question of whether one compromise or another was permissible. Footnote. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed between Soviet Russia and the powers of the Quadruple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, on March 3, 1918, at Brest-Litovsk, and was ratified on March 15 by the Fourth Extraordinary All-Russia Congress of Soviets. The peace terms were very harsh for Soviet Russia. According to the treaty, Poland, almost all the Baltic states, and part of Belorussia were placed under the control of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ukraine was separated from Soviet Russia, becoming a state dependent on Germany. Turkey gained control of the cities of Kars, Batum, and Ardagan. In August 1918, Germany imposed on Soviet Russia a supplementary treaty and a financial agreement containing new and exorbitant demands. The treaty prevented further needless loss of life and gave the RSFSR the ability to shift its attention to urgent domestic matters. The signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk promoted the struggle for peace among the broad masses of all warring nations and denounced the war as a struggle between imperialist powers. On November 13, 1918, following the November Revolution in Germany, which overthrew the monarchist regime, the All-Russia Central Executive Committee annulled the predatory Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. End of footnote. In 1908, the left, in quotation marks, Bolsheviks, were expelled from our party for stubbornly refusing to understand the necessity of participating in a most reactionary parliament. Footnote. Reference is to the Otzovists. The term Otzovist derives from the Russian verb otozvat, meaning to recall, and ultimatumists, the struggle against whom developed in 1908, and in 1909 resulted in the expulsion of A. Bogdanov, the Otzovist leader from the Bolshevik Party. Behind a screen of revolutionary phrases, the Otzovists demanded the recall of the Social Democrat deputies from the Third Duma and the cessation of activities in legal organizations such as trade unions, the cooperatives, etc. Ultimatumism was a variety of Otzovism. The ultimatumists did not realize the necessity of conducting persistent day-by-day work with the Social Democrat deputies so as to make them consistent revolutionary parliamentarians. They proposed that an ultimatum should be presented to the Social Democratic group in the Duma, demanding their absolute subordination to the decisions of the party's Central Committee. Should the deputies fail to comply, they were to be recalled from the Duma. A conference of the enlarged editorial board of the Bolshevik paper Proletariat, held in June 1909, pointed out in its decision that, quote, Bolshevism as a definite trend in the RSDLP had nothing in common either with Otzovism or with ultimatumism, unquote. The conference urged the Bolsheviks, quote, to wage a most resolute struggle against these deviations from the path of revolutionary Marxism, unquote. The CPSU in the resolutions and decisions of its congresses, conferences, and plenums of the Central Committee, Part 1, 1954, page 221, end of footnote. The quote-unquote lefts, among whom there were many splendid revolutionaries, who subsequently were and still are commendable members of the Communist Party, based themselves particularly on the successful experience of the 1905 boycott. When in August 1905 the Tsar proclaimed the convocation of a consultative parliament, the Bolsheviks called for its boycott, in the teeth of all the opposition parties and the Mensheviks, and the parliament was in fact swept away by the revolution of October 1905. Footnote: on August 6, 19 in the new calendar style, 1905, the Tsar's manifesto was made public, proclaiming the law on setting up of the Duma and the election procedures. This body was known as the Bulygin Duma, after A.G. Bulygin, the Minister of the Interior, whom the Tsar entrusted with drawing up the Duma draft. According to the latter, the Duma had no legislative functions, but could merely discuss certain questions as a consultative body under the Tsar. The Bolsheviks called upon the workers and peasants to actively boycott the Bulygin Duma and concentrate all agitation on the slogans of an armed uprising, revolutionary army, and a provisional revolutionary government. The boycott campaign against the Bulygin Duma was used by the Bolsheviks to mobilize all the revolutionary forces, organize mass political strikes, and prepare for an armed uprising. Elections to the Bulygin Duma were not held, and the government was unable to convene it. The Duma was swept away by the mounting tide of the revolution and the All-Russia October political strike of 1905. This strike, which involved over 2 million people, was conducted under the slogan of the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy, an active boycott of the Bulygin Duma, and summoning of a constituent assembly and the establishment of a democratic republic. The All-Russia political strike showed the strength of the working-class movement, fostered the development of the revolutionary struggle in the countryside, the army and the navy. The October strike led the proletariat to the December armed uprising. Concerning the October strike, see the article by V.I. Lenin, The All-Russia Political Strike, present edition, volume 9, pages 392-95. End of footnote. The boycott proved correct at the time, not because non-participation in reactionary parliaments is correct in general, but because we accurately appraised the objective situation, which was leading to the rapid development of the mass strikes, first into a political strike, then into a revolutionary strike, and finally into an uprising. Moreover, the struggle centered at that time on the question of whether the convocation of the first representative assembly should be left to the Tsar, or an attempt should be made to wrest its convocation from the old regime. When there was not, and could not be, any certainty that the objective situation was of a similar kind, and when there was no certainty of a similar trend and the same rate of development, the boycott was no longer correct. The Bolshevik boycott of Parliament in 1905 enriched the revolutionary proletariat with highly valuable political experience, and showed that when legal and illegal parliamentary and non-parliamentary forms of struggle are combined, it is sometimes useful and even essential to reject parliamentary forms. It would, however, be highly erroneous to apply this experience blindly, imitatively, and uncritically to other conditions and other situations. The Bolsheviks' boycott of the Duma in 1906 was a mistake, although a minor and easily remediable one. Footnote: what applies to individuals also applies, with necessary modifications, to politics and parties. It is not he who makes no mistakes that is intelligent. There are no such men, nor can there be. It is he whose errors are not very grave, and who is able to rectify them easily and quickly, that is intelligent. End of Lenin's footnote. The boycott of the Duma in 1907 and 1908 and subsequent years was a most serious error and difficult to remedy, because, on the one hand, a very rapid rise of the revolutionary tide and its conversion into an uprising was not to be expected, and on the other hand, the entire historical situation attendant upon the renovation of the bourgeois monarchy called for legal and illegal activities being combined. Today, when we look back at this fully completed historical period, whose connection with the subsequent periods has now become quite clear, it becomes most obvious that in 1908 to 1914, the Bolsheviks could not have preserved, let alone strengthened and developed, the core of the revolutionary party of the proletariat, had they not upheld in a most strenuous struggle the viewpoint that it was obligatory to combine legal and illegal forms of struggle, and that it was obligatory to participate even in a most reactionary parliament, and in a number of other institutions hemmed in by reactionary laws, sick benefit societies, etc. In 1918, things did not reach a split. At that time, the quote-unquote left communists formed only a separate group or faction within our party, and that not for long. In the same year, 1918, The most prominent representatives of quote-unquote left communism, for example Comrades Radek and Bukharin, openly acknowledged their error. It had seemed to them that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a compromise with the imperialists, which was inexcusable on principle and harmful to the party of the revolutionary proletariat. It was indeed a compromise with the imperialists, but it was a compromise which, under the circumstances, had to be made. Today, when I hear our tactics in signing the Brest-Litovsk Treaty being attacked by the socialist revolutionaries, for instance, or when I hear Comrade Lansbury say in a conversation with me, quote, "Our British trade union leaders say that if it was permissible for the Bolsheviks to compromise, it is permissible for them to compromise too," unquote, I usually reply by first of all giving a simple and popular example. Imagine that your car is held up by armed bandits. You hand them over your money, passport, revolver, and car. In return, you are rid of the pleasant company of the bandits. This is unquestionably a compromise. Du ou de, I give you money, firearms, and a car, so that you give me the opportunity to get away from you with a whole skin. It would, however, be difficult to find a sane man who would declare such a compromise to be inadmissible on principle, quote-unquote, or who would call the compromiser an accomplice of the bandits, even though the bandits might use the car and the firearms for further robberies. Our compromise with the bandits of German imperialism was just that kind of compromise. But when in 1914 to 1918, and then in 1918 to 1920, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries in Russia, the Scheidemanites, and to a large extent the Kotskyites in Germany, Otto Bauer and Friedrich Adler, to say nothing of the Renners and Company in Austria, the Renadels and Longuets and Company in France, the Fabians, the Independents, and the Labourites in Britain, entered into compromises with the bandits of their own bourgeoisie, and sometimes of the allied bourgeoisie, and against the revolutionary proletariat of their own countries, all these gentlemen were actually acting as accomplices in banditry. The conclusion is clear. To reject compromises on principle, quote-unquote, to reject the permissibility of compromises in general, no matter of what kind, is childishness, which it is difficult even to consider seriously. A political leader who desires to be useful to the revolutionary proletariat must be able to distinguish concrete cases of compromises that are inexcusable and are an expression of opportunism and treachery. He must direct all the force of criticism, the full intensity of merciless exposure and relentless war against these concrete compromises, and not allow the past masters of quote-unquote practical socialism and the parliamentary Jesuits to dodge and wriggle out of responsibility by means of disquisitions on quote-unquote compromises in general. It is in this way that the leaders of the British trade unions, as well as of the Fabian Society and the Independent Labour Party, dodge responsibility for the treachery they have perpetrated, for having made a compromise that is really tantamount to the worst kind of opportunism, treachery, and betrayal. There are different kinds of compromises. One must be able to analyze the situation and the concrete conditions of each compromise, or of each variety of compromise. One must learn to distinguish between a man who has given up his money and firearms to bandits so as to lessen the evil they can do and to facilitate their capture and execution, and a man who gives his money and firearms to the bandits so as to share in the loot. In politics, this is by no means always as elementary as it is in this childishly simple example. However, anyone who is out to think up for the workers some kind of recipe that will provide them with a cut-and-dry solution for all contingencies, or promises that the policy of the revolutionary proletariat will never come up against difficult or complex situations, is a charlatan. To leave no room for misinterpretation, I shall attempt to outline, if only very briefly, several fundamental rules for the analysis of concrete compromises. This party, which entered into a compromise with the German imperialists by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, had been evolving its internationalism in practice ever since the end of 1914. It was not afraid to call for the defeat of the Tsarist monarchy and to condemn quote-unquote defense of country in a war between two imperialist robbers. The parliamentary representatives of this party preferred exile in Siberia to taking a road leading to ministerial portfolios in a bourgeois government. The revolution that overthrew Tsarism and established a democratic republic put this party to a new and tremendous test. It did not enter into any kind of agreements with its own imperialists, but prepared and brought about their overthrow. When it had assumed political power, this party did not leave a vestige of either landed or capitalist ownership. After making public and repudiating the imperialists' secret treaties, this party proposed peace to all nations, and yielded to the violence of the Brest-Litovsk robbers only after the Anglo-French imperialists had torpedoed the conclusion of a peace, and after the Bolsheviks had done everything humanly possible to hasten the revolution in Germany and other countries. The absolute correctness of this compromise, entered into by such a party in such a situation, is becoming ever clearer and more obvious with every day. The Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries in Russia, like all the leaders of the Second International throughout the world in 1914 to 1920, began with treachery, by directly or indirectly justifying quote-unquote defense of country, that is, defense of their own predatory bourgeoisie. They continued their treachery by entering into a coalition with the bourgeoisie of their own country and fighting together with their own bourgeoisie against the revolutionary proletariat of their own country. Their bloc, first with Kerensky and the cadets, and then with Kolchak and Denikin in Russia, like the bloc of their confreres abroad with the bourgeoisie of their respective countries, was in fact desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. From beginning to end, their compromise with the bandits of imperialism meant their becoming accomplices in imperialist banditry. Chapter 5. Quote-unquote left-wing communism in Germany. The leaders, the party, the class, the masses.
The German communists we must now speak of call themselves not left-wingers, but, if I'm not mistaken, quote-unquote an opposition on principle. Footnote. The opposition on principle, a group of German left-wing communists advocating anarcho-syndicalist views. When the Second Congress of the Communist Party of Germany, which was held in Heidelberg in October 1919, expelled the opposition, the latter formed the so-called Communist Workers' Party of Germany in April 1920. To facilitate the unification of all German communist forces and win over the finest proletarian elements in the CWPG, the opposition was temporarily admitted into the Communist International in November 1920 with the rights of a sympathizing member. However, the Executive Committee of the Communist International still considered the United Communist Party of Germany to be the only authoritative section of the Comintern. CWPG's representatives were admitted into the Comintern on the condition that they merged with the United Communist Party of Germany and supported all its activities. The CWPG leaders, however, failed to observe these conditions. The Third Congress of the Communist International, which was held in June to July 1921 and wanted solidarity with workers who still followed the CWPG leaders, resolved to give the CWPG 2 months to call a Congress and settle the question of affiliation. The CWPG leaders did not obey the Third Congress's resolution and thus placed themselves outside the Communist International. Later, the CWPG degenerated into a small sectarian group without any support in the working class. End of footnote. From what follows below, it will, however, be seen that they reveal all the symptoms of the quote-unquote infantile disorder of leftism. Published by the local group in Frankfurt am Main, quote-unquote, a pamphlet reflecting the point of view of this opposition and entitled The Split in the Communist Party of Germany, the Spartacus League, sets forth the substance of this opposition's views most saliently and with the utmost clarity and concision. A few quotations will suffice to acquaint the reader with that substance. Quote, the Communist Party is the party of the most determined class struggle, unquote. Quote, politically the transitional period is one of the proletarian dictatorship. The question arises, who is to exercise this dictatorship, the Communist Party or the proletarian class? Fundamentally, should we strive for a dictatorship of the Communist Party or for a dictatorship of the proletarian class, unquote. The author of the pamphlet goes on to accuse the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Germany of seeking ways of achieving a coalition with the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, and of raising, quote, the question of recognizing in principle all political means, unquote, of struggle, including parliamentarism, with the sole purpose of concealing its actual and main efforts to form a coalition with the independents. The pamphlet goes on to say, quote, the opposition have chosen another road. They are of the opinion that the question of the rule of the Communist Party and of the dictatorship of the party is merely one of tactics. In any case, rule by the Communist Party is the ultimate form of any party rule. Fundamentally, we must work for the dictatorship of the proletarian class. and all the measures of the party, its organizations, methods of struggle, strategy, and tactics should be directed to that end. Accordingly, all compromise with other parties, all reversion to parliamentary forms of struggle, which have become historically and politically obsolete, and any policy of maneuvering and compromise must be emphatically rejected. Quote, specifically proletarian methods of revolutionary struggle must be strongly emphasized. New forms of organization must be created on the widest basis and with the widest scope, in order to enlist the most extensive proletarian circles and strata to take part in the revolutionary struggle under the leadership of the Communist Party. A workers' union, based on factory organizations, should be the rallying point for all revolutionary elements. This should unite all workers who will follow the slogan, "Get out of the trade unions." It is here that the militant proletariat musters its ranks for battle. Recognition of the class struggle, of the Soviet system, and of the dictatorship should be sufficient for enrollment. All subsequent political education of the fighting masses and their political orientation in the struggle are tasks of the Communist Party, which stands outside the workers' union. Consequently, two Communist parties are now arrayed against each other. One is a party of leaders, which is out to organize the revolutionary struggle and to direct it from above, accepting compromises and parliamentarism, so as to create a situation enabling it to join a coalition government, exercising a dictatorship. The other is a mass party, which expects an upsurge of the revolutionary struggle from below, which knows and applies a single method in this struggle, a method which clearly leads to the goal, and rejects all parliamentary and opportunist methods. That single method is the unconditional overthrow of the bourgeoisie, so as then to set up the proletarian class dictatorship for the accomplishment of socialism. There, the dictatorship of leaders, here the dictatorship of the masses. That is our slogan.
Unquote. Such are the main features characterizing the views of the opposition in the German Communist Party.
Any Bolshevik who has consciously participated in the development of Bolshevism since 1903, or has closely observed that development, will at once say after reading these arguments, "What old and familiar rubbish! What left-wing childishness!" But let us examine these arguments a little more closely. The mere presentation of the question, quote, dictatorship of the party, or the dictatorship of the class, dictatorship of the leaders, or dictatorship of the masses, unquote, testifies to most incredibly and hopelessly muddled thinking. These people want to invent something quite out of the ordinary, and in their effort to be clever, make themselves ridiculous. It is common knowledge that the masses are divided into classes, that the masses can be contrasted with classes only by contrasting the vast majority in general, regardless of division according to status in the social system of production, with categories holding a definite status in the social system of production. That, as a rule, and in most cases, at least in the present-day civilized countries, classes are led by political parties, that political parties, as a general rule, are run by more or less stable groups composed of the most authoritative, influential, and experienced members, who are elected to the most responsible positions and are called leaders.
All this is elementary. All this is clear and simple.
Why replace this with some kind of rigmarole, some new Volapük?
On the one hand,
these people seem to have got muddled when they found themselves in a predicament. When the party's abrupt transition from legality to illegality upset the customary, normal, and simple relations between leaders, parties, and classes. In Germany, as in other European countries, people had become too accustomed to legality, to the free and proper election of leaders, at regular party congresses, to the convenient methods of testing the class composition of parties through parliamentary elections, mass meetings, the press, the sentiments of the trade unions and other associations, etc. When, instead of this customary procedure, it became necessary, because of the stormy development of the revolution and the development of the Civil War, to go over rapidly from legality to illegality, to combine the two, and to adopt the quote-unquote inconvenient and quote-unquote undemocratic methods of selecting or forming or preserving groups of leaders, people lost their bearings and began to think up some unmitigated nonsense. Certain members of the Communist Party of Holland, who were unlucky enough to be born in a small country with traditions and conditions of highly privileged and highly stable legality, and who had never seen a transition from legality to illegality, probably fell into confusion, lost their heads, and helped create these absurd inventions. On the other hand, one can see simply a thoughtless and incoherent use of the now fashionable terms, masses and leaders. These people have heard and memorized a great many attacks on leaders, in which the latter have been contrasted with the masses. However, they have proved unable to think matters out, and gain a clear understanding of what it was all about. The divergence between quote-unquote leaders and quote-unquote masses was brought out with particular clarity and sharpness in all countries at the end of the imperialist war and following it. The principal reason for this was explained many times by Marx and Engels between the years 1852 and 1892, from the example of Britain. That country's exclusive position led to the emergence from the masses of a semi-petty bourgeois opportunist labor aristocracy. The leaders of this labor aristocracy were constantly going over to the bourgeoisie, and were directly or indirectly on its payroll. Marx earned the honor of incurring the hatred of these disreputable persons by openly branding them as traitors. Present-day 20th century imperialism has given a few advanced countries an exceptionally privileged position, which everywhere in the Second International has produced a certain type of traitor, opportunist and social chauvinist leaders who champion the interests of their own craft, their own section of the labor aristocracy. The opportunist parties have become separated from the masses, that is, from the broadest strata of the working people, their majority, the lowest paid workers. The revolutionary proletariat cannot be victorious unless this evil is combated, unless the opportunist, social traitor leaders are exposed, discredited, and expelled. That is the policy the Third International has embarked on. To go so far in this connection as to contrast, in general, the dictatorship of the masses with the dictatorship of the leaders is ridiculously absurd and stupid. What is particularly amusing is that, in fact, instead of the old leaders who hold generally accepted views on simple matters, new leaders are brought forth under the cover of the slogan "Down with the Leaders," who talk rank stuff and nonsense. Such are Laufenberg, Wollheim, Horner, Karl Schroeder, Friedrich Wendel, and Karl Erler in Germany. Footnote: Horner Karl, pseudonym of Anton Pannekow.
End of footnote.
Erler's attempts to give the question more profundity and to claim that, in general, political parties are unnecessary and quote-unquote bourgeois are so supremely absurd that one can only shrug one's shoulders. It all goes to drive home the truth that a minor error can always assume monstrous proportions if it is persisted in, if profound justifications are sought for it, and if it is carried to its logical conclusion. Lenin's footnote. Karl Erler, The Dissolution of the Party, Kommunistische Arbeiterzeitung, Hamburg, February 7, 1920, number 32. Quote, "The working class cannot destroy the bourgeois state without destroying bourgeois democracy, and it cannot destroy bourgeois democracy without destroying parties." Unquote. The more muddle-headed of the syndicalists and anarchists in the Latin countries may derive satisfaction from the fact that solid Germans, who evidently consider themselves Marxists by their articles in the above-mentioned paper, K. Erler and K. Horner, have shown most plainly that they consider themselves sound Marxists, but talk incredible nonsense in a most ridiculous manner and reveal their failures to understand the ABC of Marxism, go to the length of making utterly inept statements. Mere acceptance of Marxism does not save one from errors. We Russians know this especially well, because Marxism has been very often the fashion in our country. Footnote. Kommunistische Arbeiterzeitung, the Communist Workers' Newspaper, organ of the anarcho-syndicalist group of the German left-wing communists. See footnote 17, the opposition on principle. The newspaper was published in Hamburg from 1919 till 1927. Karl Erler, who is mentioned by V.I. Lenin, was Heinrich Laufenberg's pen name. End of footnote. Repudiation of the party principle and of party discipline, that is what the opposition has arrived at, and this is tantamount to completely disarming the proletariat in the interest of the bourgeoisie. It all adds up to that petty bourgeois diffuseness and instability, that incapacity for sustained effort, unity and organized action, which, if encouraged, must inevitably destroy any proletarian revolutionary movement. From the standpoint of communism, repudiation of the party principle means attempting to leap from the eve of capitalism's collapse, in Germany, not to the lower or the intermediate phase of communism, but to the higher. We in Russia, in the third year since the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, are making the first steps in the transition from capitalism to socialism, or to the lower stage of communism. Classes still remain, and will remain everywhere, for years after the proletariat's conquest of power. Perhaps in Britain, where there is no peasantry, but where petty proprietors exist, this period may be shorter. The abolition of classes means not merely ousting the landowners and the capitalists. That is something we accomplished with comparative ease. It also means abolishing small commodity producers, and they cannot be ousted or crushed. We must learn to live with them. They can and must be transformed and re-educated only by means of a very prolonged, slow and cautious organizational work. They surround the proletariat on every side with a petty bourgeois atmosphere, which permeates and corrupts the proletariat, and constantly causes among the proletariat relapses into petty bourgeois spinelessness, disunity, individualism, and alternating moods of exaltation and dejection. The strictest centralization and discipline are required within the political party of the proletariat in order to counteract this, in order that the organizational role of the proletariat, and that is, its principal role, may be exercised correctly, successfully, and victoriously. The dictatorship of the proletariat means a persistent struggle, bloody and bloodless, violent and peaceful, military and economic, educational and administrative, against the forces and traditions of the old society. The force of habit in millions and tens of millions is a most formidable force. Without a party of iron which has been tempered in the struggle, a party enjoying the confidence of all honest people in the class in question, a party capable of watching and influencing the mood of the masses, such a struggle cannot be waged successfully. It is 1,000 times easier to vanquish the centralized big bourgeoisie than to vanquish, quote-unquote, the millions upon millions of petty proprietors. However, through their ordinary, everyday, imperceptible, elusive, and demoralizing activities, they produce the very results which the bourgeoisie need and which tend to restore the bourgeoisie. Whoever brings about even the slightest weakening of the iron discipline of the party of the proletariat, especially during its dictatorship, is actually aiding the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. Parallel with the question of the leaders, the party, the class, the masses, we must pose the question of the quote-unquote reactionary trade unions. But first I shall take the liberty of making a few concluding remarks based on the experience of our party. There have always been attacks on the quote-unquote dictatorship of leaders in our party. The first time I heard such attacks, I recall, was in 1895, when officially no party yet existed, but a central group was taking shape in St. Petersburg, which was to assume the leadership of the district groups. Footnote. Reference is to the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, organized by V.I. Lenin in the autumn of 1895. The League of Struggle united about 20 Marxist circles in St. Petersburg. It was headed by the central group, including V.I. Lenin, A.A. Ivaneyev, P.K. Zaporizhzhich, G.M. Krishanovsky, N.K. Krupskaya, L. Martov, M.A. Silvin, V.V. Starkov, and others. 5 members headed by V.I. Lenin directed the League's activities. The organization was divided into district groups. Progressive workers such as I.V. Babushkin, V.A. Shelgunov, and others linked these groups with the factories. The St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class was, in V.I. Lenin's words, the embryo of a revolutionary party, based on the working class movement and giving leadership to the class struggle of the proletariat. End of footnote. At the 9th Congress of our party, April 1920, there was a small opposition, which also spoke against the quote-unquote dictatorship of leaders, against the quote-unquote oligarchy, and so on. There is therefore nothing surprising, new, or terrible in the infantile disorder of left-wing communism, quote-unquote, among the Germans. Footnote. The Congress was held in Moscow from March 29 to April 5, 1920. The 9th Congress was more numerous than any previous party congresses. It was attended by 715 delegates, 553 of them with full votes, and 162 with deliberative votes, representing a membership of 611,978. Represented were the party organizations of Central Russia, the Ukraine, the Urals, Siberia, and other regions recently liberated by the Red Army. Many of the delegates came to the Congress straight from the front. The agenda of the Congress was as follows. 1. The report of the Central Committee. 2. The immediate tasks of economic construction. 3. The trade union movement. 4. Organizational questions. 5. The tasks of the Communist International. 6. The attitude towards the cooperatives. 7. The change over to the militia system. 8. Elections to the Central Committee. 9. Miscellaneous. The Congress was held under the guidance of V.I. Lenin, who was the main speaker on the political work of the Central Committee and replied to the debate on the report. He also spoke on economic construction and cooperation, made the speech at the closing of the Congress, and submitted a proposal on the list of candidates to the party's Central Committee. In the resolution, The Immediate Tasks of Economic Development, the Congress noted that, quote, "The basic condition of economic rehabilitation of the country is a steady implementation of a single economic plan for the coming historical epoch," unquote. The CPSU in the resolutions and decisions of its congresses, conferences, and plenums of the Central Committee, Part 1, 1954, page 478. The kingpin of the single economic plan was electrification, which via Lenin considered a great program for a period of 10 to 20 years. The directives of the Ninth Congress were the basis of the plan conclusively drawn up by the State Commission for the Electrification of Russia, the Goelro Plan, and approved by the All-Russia Congress of Soviets in December 1920. The Congress paid particular attention to the organization of industrial management. The resolution on this question called for establishment of competent, firm, and energetic one-man management. Taking its guidance from Lenin, the Congress especially stressed the necessity to extensively enlist old and experienced experts. The anti-party group of democratic centralists, consisting of Sapranov, Osinsky, V. Smirnov, and others, came out against the party line. Behind the cover of phrases about democratic centralism, in fact distorting that principle, they denied the need for one-man management at factories, came out against strict party and state discipline, and alleged that the Central Committee did not give effect to the principle of collective leadership. The group of democratic centralists was supported at the Congress by Rykov, Tomsky, Milyutin, and Lomov. Congress rebuffed the democratic centralists and rejected their proposals. Congress gave special attention to labor emulation and communist subotniks. To stimulate such emulation, the extensive application of the bonus system of wages was recommended. The Congress resolved that May 1st, the International Proletarian Holiday, which in 1920 fell on Saturday, should be a mass subotnik organized throughout Russia. An important place in the work of the Congress was held by the question of trade unions, which was considered from the viewpoint of adapting the entire work of the trade unions to the accomplishment of economic tasks. In a resolution on this question, the Congress distinctly defined the trade unions' role, their relations with the state and the party, forms and methods of guidance of trade unions by the Communist Party, as well as forms of their participation in communist construction. The Congress decisively rebuffed the anarcho-syndicalist elements, Shlyapnikov, Lazovsky, Tomsky, and Lutinov, who advocated the independence, quote-unquote, of the trade unions and contraposed them to the Communist Party and the Soviet government. At a closed meeting held on April 4th, the Congress elected a new Central Committee of 19 members and 12 candidate members. The former included V.I. Lenin, A.A. Andreev, F.E. Zhezhinsky, M.I. Kalinin, Y.E. Rudzatek, F.A. Sergeyev, Artyom, and J.V. Stalin. On April 5th, the Congress concluded its work. End of footnote.
The ailment involves no danger, and after it the organism even becomes more robust. In our case, on the other hand, the rapid alternation of legal and illegal work, which made it necessary to keep the general staff, the leaders, under cover and cloak them in the greatest secrecy, sometimes gave rise to extremely dangerous consequences. The worst of these was that in 1912 the agent provocateur Malinovsky got into the Bolshevik Central Committee. He betrayed scores and scores of the best and most loyal comrades, caused them to be sentenced to penal servitude, and hastened the death of many of them. That he did not cause still greater harm was due to the correct balance between legal and illegal work. As member of the party's Central Committee and Duma deputy, Malinovsky was forced, in order to gain our confidence, to help us establish legal daily papers, which, even under Tsarism, were able to wage a struggle against the Menshevik opportunism and to spread the fundamentals of Bolshevism in a suitably disguised form. While, with one hand, Malinovsky sent scores and scores of the finest Bolsheviks to penal servitude and death, he was obliged, with the other, to assist in the education of scores and scores of thousands of new Bolsheviks through the medium of the legal press. Those German and also British, American, French, and Italian comrades who are faced with the task of learning how to conduct revolutionary work within the reactionary trade unions would do as well to give serious thought to this. Footnote. Malinovsky was a prisoner of war in Germany. On his return to Russia when the Bolsheviks were in power, he was instantly put on trial and shot by our workers. The Mensheviks attacked us most bitterly for our mistake, the fact that an agent provocateur had become a member of the Central Committee of our party. But when, under Kerensky, we demanded the arrest and trial of Rudzianko, the chairman of the Duma, because he had known, even before the war, that Malinovsky was an agent provocateur and had not informed the Trudoviks and the workers in the Duma, neither the Mensheviks nor the socialist revolutionaries in the Kerensky government supported our demand, and Rodzianko remained at large and made off unhindered to join Denikin. End of footnote. In many countries, including the most advanced, the bourgeoisie are undoubtedly sending agents provocateurs in the communist parties and will continue to do so. A skillful combination of illegal and legal work is one of the ways to combat this danger. Chapter 6. Should revolutionaries work in reactionary trade unions? The German lefts, quote-unquote, consider that, as far as they are concerned, the reply to this question is an unqualified negative. In their opinion, declamations and angry outcries, such as uttered by K. Horner in a particularly solid and particularly stupid manner against quote-unquote reactionary and quote-unquote counter-revolutionary trade unions, are sufficient proof that it is unnecessary and even inexcusable for revolutionaries and communists to work in yellow, social chauvinist, compromising and counter-revolutionary trade unions of the Legion type. However firmly the German quote-unquote lefts may be convinced of the revolutionism of such tactics, the latter are in fact fundamentally wrong and contain nothing but empty phrases. To make this clear, I shall begin with our own experience, in keeping with the general plan of the present pamphlet, which is aimed at applying to Western Europe whatever is universally practicable, significant and relevant in the history and the present-day tactics of Bolshevism. In Russia today, the connection between leaders, party, class, and masses, as well as the attitude of the dictatorship of the proletariat and its party to the trade unions, are concretely as follows. The dictatorship is exercised by the proletariat organized in the Soviets. The proletariat is guided by the Communist Party of Bolsheviks, which, according to the figures of the latest Party Congress, April 1920, has a membership of 611,000. The membership varied greatly both before and after the October Revolution, and used to be much smaller even in 1918 and 1919. Footnote. Between the February 1917 revolution and 1919 inclusively, the party's membership changed as follows. By 7th All-Russia Congress of the RSDLPB, April 1917, the party numbered 80,000 members. By the 6th RSDLPB Congress in July to August 1917, about 240,000 members. By 7th Congress of the RSPB in March 1918, not less than 270,000. By 8th Congress of RCPB in March 1919, 313,766 members. End of footnote. We are apprehensive of an excessive growth of the party, because careerists and charlatans, who deserve only to be shot, inevitably do all they can to insinuate themselves into the ranks of the ruling party. The last time we opened wide the doors of the party, to workers and peasants only, was when, in the winter of 1919, Yudenich was within a few versts of Petrograd, and Denikin was in Orel, about 350 versts from Moscow. That is, when the Soviet Republic was in mortal danger, and when adventurers, careerists, charlatans, and unreliable persons generally could not possibly count on making a profitable career, and had more reason to expect the gallows and torture by joining the communists. Footnote. The reference is to Party Week, which was held in accordance with the resolution of the 8th Congress of the RCPB on building up the party's membership. The Party Week was conducted in conditions of the bitter struggle waged by the Soviet state against the foreign intervention and domestic counter-revolution. Party Week was first held in the Petrograd organization of the RCPB, August 10th to 17th, 1919. The second Party Week was held in Petrograd in October to November 1919. Between September 20th and 28th, a Party Week was held in the Moscow Gubernia organization. Summarizing the experience of the first Party Weeks, the plenum of the Central Committee of the RCPB, held on September 26, 1919, resolved that Party Weeks should be held in cities, the countryside, and the army. At the end of September, the Central Committee addressed a circular to all party organizations, pointing out that, as the re-registration and purge of the membership had been accomplished in almost all party organizations, new members might be enrolled. The Central Committee stressed that, during the Party Weeks, only industrial workers, peasants, and Red Army and Navy men should be admitted into the party. As a result of the Party Weeks, over 200,000 joined the party in 38 gubernias of the European part of the RSFSR, more than half of them being industrial workers. Over 25% of the armed forces' strength joined the party at the fronts. End of footnote. The party, which holds annual congresses, the most recent on the basis of 1 delegate per 1,000 members, is directed by a central committee of 19 elected at the Congress, while the current work in Moscow has to be carried on by still smaller bodies, known as the Organizing Bureau and the Political Bureau, which are elected at plenary meetings of the Central Committee, 5 members of the Central Committee to each bureau. This, it would appear, is a full-fledged oligarchy, quote-unquote. No important political or organizational question is decided by any state institution in our republic without guidance of the party's Central Committee. In its work, the party relies directly on the trade unions, which, according to the data of the last Congress, April 1920, now have a membership of over 4 million and are formally non-party. All the directing bodies of the vast majority of the unions, and primarily, of course, of the All Russia General Trade Union Center or Bureau, the All Russia Central Council of Trade Unions, are made up of communists and carry out all the directives of the party. Thus, on the whole, we have a formally non-communist, flexible and relatively wide and very powerful proletarian apparatus, by means of which the party is closely linked up with the class and the masses, and by means of which, under the leadership of the party, the class dictatorship is exercised. Without close contacts with the trade unions, and without their energetic support and devoted efforts, not only in economic, but also in military affairs, it would of course have been impossible for us to govern the country and to maintain the dictatorship for 2.5 months, let alone 2.5 years. In practice, these very close contacts naturally call for highly complex and diversified work in the form of propaganda, agitation, timely and frequent conferences, not only with the leading trade union workers, but with influential trade union workers generally. They call for a determined struggle against the Mensheviks, who still have a certain, though very small following, to whom they teach all kinds of counter-revolutionary machinations, ranging from an ideological defense of bourgeois democracy and preaching that the trade union should be, quote-unquote, independent of the proletarian state power, to sabotage of proletarian discipline, etc., etc. We consider that contacts with the masses through the trade unions are not enough. In the course of our revolution, practical activities have given rise to such institutions as non-party workers' and peasants' conferences, and we strive by every means to support, develop, and extend this institution in order to be able to observe the temper of the masses, come closer to them, meet their requirements, promote the best among them to state posts, etc. Under a recent decree on the transformation of the People's Commissariat of State Control into the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, non-party conferences of this kind have been empowered to select members of the state control to carry out various kinds of investigations, etc. Then, of course, all the work of the party is carried on through the Soviets, which embrace the working masses irrespective of occupation. The district congresses of Soviets are democratic institutions, the like of which even the best of the democratic republics of the bourgeois world have never known. Through these congresses, whose proceedings the party endeavors to follow with the closest attention, as well as by continually appointing class-conscious workers to various posts in the rural districts, the proletariat exercises its role of leader of the peasantry, gives effect to the dictatorship of the urban proletariat, wages a systematic struggle against the rich, bourgeois, exploiting and profiteering peasantry, etc. Such is the general mechanism of the proletarian state power, viewed, quote-unquote, from above, from the standpoint of the practical implementation of the dictatorship. We hope that the reader will understand why the Russian Bolshevik, who has known this mechanism for 25 years and has seen it develop out of small, illegal and underground circles, cannot help regarding all this talk about, quote-unquote, from above or, quote-unquote, from below, about the dictatorship of leaders or the dictatorship of the masses, etc., as ridiculous and childish nonsense, something like discussing whether a man's left leg or right arm is of greater use to him. We cannot but regard as equally ridiculous and childish nonsense the pompous, very learned, and frightfully revolutionary disquisitions of the German lefts to the effect that communists cannot and should not work in reactionary trade unions, that it is permissible to turn down such work, that it is necessary to withdraw from the trade unions and create a brand new and immaculate workers' union, quote-unquote, invented by a very pleasant, and probably for the most part very youthful,
communists, etc., etc. Capitalism inevitably leaves socialism the legacy, on the one hand, of the old trade and craft distinctions among the workers, distinctions evolved in the course of centuries. On the other hand, trade unions, which only very slowly, in the course of years and years, can and will develop into broader industrial unions, with less of the craft union about them, embracing entire industries and not only crafts, trades and occupations, and later proceed through these industrial unions to eliminate the division of labor among people, to educate and school people, give them all-around development and an all-around training so that they are able to do everything. Communism is advancing and must advance towards that goal, and will reach it, but only after very many years. To attempt in practice today to anticipate this future result of a fully developed, fully stabilized and constituted, fully comprehensive and mature communism would be like trying to teach higher mathematics to a child of 4. We can and must begin to build socialism, not with abstract human material, or with human material specifically prepared by us, but with the human material bequeathed to us by capitalism. True, that is no easy matter, but no other approach to this task is serious enough to warrant discussion. The trade unions were a tremendous step forward for the working class in the early days of capitalist development, inasmuch as they marked a transition from the workers' disunity and helplessness to the rudiments of class organization. When the revolutionary party of the proletariat, the highest form of proletarian class organization, began to take shape, and the party will not merit the name until it learns to weld the leaders into one indivisible whole with the class and the masses, the trade unions inevitably began to reveal certain reactionary features, a certain craft narrow-mindedness, a certain tendency to be non-political, a certain inertness, etc. However, the development of the proletariat did not, and could not, proceed anywhere in the world otherwise than through the trade unions, through reciprocal action between them and the party of the working class. The proletariat's conquest of political power is a gigantic step forward for the proletariat as a class, and the party must more than ever, and in a new way, not only in the old, educate and guide the trade unions, at the same time bearing in mind that they are and will long remain an indispensable school of communism, and a preparatory school that trains proletarians to exercise their dictatorship, an indispensable organization of the workers for the gradual transfer of the management of the whole economic life of the country to the working class, and not to the separate trades, and later to all the working people. In a sense mentioned above, a certain reactionism in the trade unions is inevitable under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Not to understand this means a complete failure to understand the fundamental conditions of the transition from capitalism to socialism. It would be egregious folly to fear this reactionism, or to try to evade or leap over it, for it would mean fearing that function of the proletarian vanguard which consists in training, educating, enlightening, and drawing into the new life the most backward strata and masses of the working class and the peasantry. On the other hand, it will be a still graver error to postpone the achievement of the dictatorship of the proletariat until a time when there will not be a single worker with a narrow-minded craft outlook, or with craft and craft union prejudices. The art of politics, and the communist's correct understanding of his tasks, consists in correctly gauging the conditions and the moment when the vanguard of the proletariat can successfully assume power, when it is able, during and after the seizure of power, to win adequate support from sufficiently broad strata of the working class and of the non-proletarian working masses, and when it is able thereafter to maintain, consolidate, and extend its rule by educating, training, and attracting ever broader masses of the working people. Further, in countries more advanced than Russia, a certain reactionism in the trade unions has been and was bound to be manifested in a far greater measure than in our own country. Our Mensheviks found support in the trade unions, and to some extent still do in a small number of unions, as a result of the latter's craft narrow-mindedness, craft selfishness, and opportunism. The Mensheviks of the West have acquired a much firmer footing in the trade unions. There, the craft union, narrow-minded, selfish, case-hardened, covetous, and petty bourgeois labor aristocracy, imperialist-minded and imperialist-corrupted, has developed into a much stronger section than in our country. That is incontestable. The struggle against the Gompercies, and against the Johow, Hendersons, Merheims, Legiens and company in Western Europe is much more difficult than the struggle against our Mensheviks, who are an absolutely homogeneous social and political type. This struggle must be waged ruthlessly, and it must unfailingly be brought, as we brought it, to a point when all the incorrigible leaders of opportunism and social chauvinism are completely discredited and driven out of the trade unions. Political power cannot be captured, and the attempt to capture it should not be made until the struggle has reached a certain stage. This certain stage will be different in different countries and in different circumstances. It can be correctly gauged only by thoughtful, experienced, and knowledgeable political leaders of the proletariat in each particular country. In Russia, the elections to the Constituent Assembly in November 1917, a few days after the Proletarian Revolution of October 25, 1917, were one of the criteria of the success of the struggle. In these elections, the Mensheviks were utterly defeated. They received 700,000 votes, 1,400,000 if the vote in Transcaucasia is added, as against 9 million votes polled by the Bolsheviks. See my article, The Constituent Assembly Elections and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, in the Communist International, numbers 7 to 8. Footnote. See Lenin Collected Works, Volume 30, pages 253 to 275. The Communist International, a journal organ of the Executive Committee of the Communist International. It was published in Russian, German, French, English, Spanish, and Chinese, the first issue appearing on May 1, 1919. The journal published theoretical articles and documents of the Comintern, including a number of articles by Lenin. It elucidated the fundamental questions of Marxist-Leninist theory in connection with the problems confronting the international working class and communist movement and the experience of socialist construction in the Soviet Union. It also waged a struggle against various anti-Leninist tendencies. Publication of the journal ceased in June 1943 in connection with the resolution adopted by the Presidium of the Comintern's Executive Committee on May 15, 1943, on the dissolution of the Communist International. End of footnote. We are waging a struggle against the labor aristocracy in the name of the masses of workers and in order to win them over to our side. We are waging a struggle against the opportunist and social chauvinist leaders in order to win the working class over to our side. It would be absurd to forget this most elementary and most self-evident truth. Yet it is this very absurdity that the German left communists perpetrate, when, because of the reactionary and counter-revolutionary character of the trade union top leadership, they jump to the conclusion that we must withdraw from the trade unions, refuse to work in them, and create new and artificial forms of labor organization. This is so unpardonable a blunder that it is tantamount to the greatest service communists could ever render the bourgeoisie. Like all the opportunist, social chauvinist, and Kautskyite trade union leaders, our Mensheviks are nothing but agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement, as we have always said the Mensheviks are, or labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, to use the splendid and profoundly true expression of the followers of Daniel De Leon in America. To refuse to work in the reactionary trade unions means leaving the insufficiently developed or backward masses of workers under the influence of the reactionary leaders, the agents of the bourgeoisie, the labor aristocrats, quote, workers who have become completely bourgeois, unquote. See Engels' letter to Marx in 1858 about the British workers. Footnote. See Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, Selected Correspondence, Moscow, 1965, page 110. End of footnote. This ridiculous theory that communists should not work in reactionary trade unions reveals with the utmost clarity the frivolous attitude of the left communists towards the question of influencing the masses and their misuse of clamor about the masses. If you want to help the masses and win the sympathy and support of the masses, you should not fear difficulties or pinpricks, chicanery, insults, and persecution from the leaders, who, being opportunists and social chauvinists, are in most cases directly or indirectly connected with the bourgeoisie and the police, but must absolutely work wherever the masses are to be found. You must be capable of any sacrifice, of overcoming the greatest obstacles, in order to carry on agitation and propaganda systematically, perseveringly, persistently, and patiently in those institutions, societies, and associations, even the most reactionary, in which proletarian or semi-proletarian masses are to be found. The trade unions and workers' cooperatives, the latter sometimes at least, are the very organizations in which the masses are to be found. According to figures quoted in the Swedish paper Folkets Dagblad Politiken of March 10, 1920, the trade union membership in Great Britain increased from 5,500,000 at the end of 1917 to 6,600,000 at the end of 1918, an increase of 19%. Towards the close of 1919, the membership was estimated at 7,500,000. I have not got the corresponding figures for France and Germany to hand, but absolutely incontestable and generally known facts testify to a rapid rise in the trade union membership in these countries too. These facts make crystal clear something that is confirmed by thousands of other symptoms, namely that class consciousness and the desire for organization are growing among the proletarian masses, among the rank and file, among the backward elements. Millions of workers in Great Britain, France, and Germany are for the first time passing from a complete lack of organization to the elementary, lowest and simplest, and, to those still thoroughly imbued with bourgeois democratic prejudices, most easily comprehensible form of organization, namely the trade unions. Yet the revolutionary but imprudent left communists stand by crying out, the masses, but refusing to work within the trade unions, on the pretext that they are quote-unquote reactionary, and invent brand new immaculate little workers' unions, which is guiltless of bourgeois democratic prejudices, and innocent of craft or narrow-minded craft union sins, a union which they claim will be a broad organization, in parentheses exclamation mark. Quote, recognition of the Soviet system and the dictatorship, unquote, will be the only condition of membership, in parentheses exclamation point. See the passage quoted above. It would be hard to imagine any greater ineptitude or greater harm to the revolution than that caused by the quote-unquote left revolutionaries. Why, if we in Russia today, after 2.5 years of unprecedented victories over the bourgeoisie of Russia and the Entente, were to make recognition of the dictatorship a condition of trade union membership, we would be doing a very foolish thing, damaging our influence among the masses, and helping the Mensheviks. The task devolving on communists is to convince the backward elements, to work among them, and not to fence themselves off from them with artificial and childishly quote-unquote left slogans. There can be no doubt that the Gompersies, the Hendersons, the John Howe, and the Legions are very grateful to those quote-unquote left revolutionaries who, like the German opposition on principle, heaven preserve us from such principles, or like some of the revolutionaries in the American industrial workers of the world, advocate quitting the reactionary trade unions and refusing to work in them. Footnote. The Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, a workers' trade union organization founded in the USA in 1905, and in the main organizing unskilled and low-paid workers of various trades. Among its founders were such working-class leaders as Daniel De Leon, Eugene Debs, and William Haywood. IWW organizations were also set up in Canada, Australia, Britain, Latin America, and South Africa. In conditions of the mass strike movement in the USA, which developed under the influence of the Russian Revolution of 1905 to 1907, the IWW organized a number of successful mass strikes, waged a struggle against the policy of class collaboration conducted by reformist leaders of the American Federation of Labor and right-wing socialists. During the First World War of 1914-18, the organization led a number of mass anti-war actions by the American working class. Some IWW leaders, among them William Haywood, welcomed the Great October Socialist Revolution and joined the Communist Party of the USA. At the same time, anarcho-syndicalist features showed up in IWW activities. It did not recognize the proletariat's political struggle, denied the party's leading role and the necessity of the proletarian dictatorship, and refused to carry on work among the membership of the American Federation of Labor. In 1920, the organization's anarcho-syndicalist leaders took advantage of the imprisonment of many revolutionaries, and against the will of the trade union masses, rejected the appeal of the Comintern's executive committee that they join the Communist International. As a result of the leaders' opportunist policy, the IWW degenerated into a sectarian organization which soon lost all influence on the working class movement. End of footnote. These men, the leaders of opportunism, will no doubt resort to every device of bourgeois diplomacy and to the aid of bourgeois governments
the clergy, the police, and the courts to keep communists out of the trade unions, oust them by every means, make their work in the trade unions as unpleasant as possible, and insult, bait, and persecute them. We must be able to stand up to all this, agree to make any sacrifice, and even, if need be, to resort to various stratagems, artifices, and illegal methods, to evasions and subterfuges, as long as we get into the trade unions, remain in them, and carry on communist work within them at all cost. Under Tsarism, we had no legal opportunities whatsoever until 1905. However, when Zubetov, agent of the secret police, organized by Black Hundred workers' assemblies and working men's societies, for the purposes of trapping revolutionaries and combating them, we sent members of our party to these assemblies and into these societies. I personally remember one of them, Comrade Babushkin, a leading St. Petersburg factory worker, shot by order of the Tsar's general in 1906. They established contacts with the masses, were able to carry on their agitation, and succeeded in wresting workers from the influence of Zubetov's agents. Lenin's footnote. The Gompersies, Hendersons, Johow, and Legions are nothing but Zubetovs, differing from our Zubetov only in their European garb and polish, and the civilized, refined, and democratically suave manner of conducting their despicable policy. End of Lenin's footnote. Of course, in Western Europe, which is imbued with most deep-rooted legalistic, constitutionalist, and bourgeois democratic prejudices, this is more difficult of achievement. However, it can and must be carried out, and systematically at that. The Executive Committee of the Third International must, in my opinion, positively condemn and call upon the next Congress of the Communist International to condemn both the policy of refusing to work in reactionary trade unions in general, explaining in detail why such refusal is unwise and what extreme harm it does to the cause of the proletarian revolution, and, in particular, the line of conduct of some members of the Communist Party of Holland who, whether directly or indirectly, overtly or covertly, wholly or partly, it does not matter, have supported this erroneous policy. The Third International must break with the tactics of the Second International. It must not evade or play down points at issue, but must post them in a straightforward fashion. The whole truth has been put squarely to the quote-unquote independents. The whole truth must likewise be put squarely to the quote-unquote left communists. Chapter 7. Should we participate in bourgeois parliaments? It is with the utmost contempt and the utmost levity that the German left communists reply to this question in the negative. Their arguments? In the passage quoted above we read, quote, "All reversion to parliamentary forms of struggle, which have become historically and politically obsolete, must be emphatically rejected." Unquote. This is said with ridiculous pretentiousness and is patently wrong. Reversion to parliamentarism, forsooth. Perhaps there is already a Soviet Republic in Germany. It does not look like it. How then can one speak of reversion? Is this not an empty phrase? Parliamentarism has become quote-unquote historically obsolete. This is true in the propaganda sense. However, everybody knows that this is still a far cry from overcoming it in practice. Capitalism could have been declared, and with full justice, to be historically obsolete many decades ago, but that does not at all remove the need for a very long and very persistent struggle on the basis of capitalism. Parliamentarism is historically obsolete from the standpoint of world history. That is, the era of bourgeois parliamentarism is over, and the era of the proletarian dictatorship has begun. That is incontestable. But world history is counted in decades. 10 or 20 years earlier or later makes no difference when measured with the yardstick of world history. From the standpoint of world history, it is a trifle that cannot be considered even approximately. But for that very reason it is a glaring theoretical error to apply the yardstick of world history to practical politics. Is parliamentarism politically obsolete? That is quite a different matter. If it were true, the position of the quote-unquote lefts would be a strong one. But it has to be proved by a most searching analysis, and the quote-unquote lefts do not even know how to approach the matter. In the Thesis on Parliamentarism, published in the Bulletin of the Provisional Bureau in Amsterdam of the Communist International, No. 1, February 1920, and obviously expressing the Dutch left, or left Dutch strivings, the analysis, as we shall see, is also hopelessly poor. In the first place, contrary to the opinion of such outstanding political leaders as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht,
The German lefts, as we know, considered parliamentarism politically obsolete, even in January 1919. We know that the lefts were mistaken. This fact alone utterly destroys, at a single stroke, the proposition that parliamentarism is politically obsolete, quote-unquote. It is for the lefts to prove why their error, indisputable at that time, is no longer an error. They do not, and cannot, produce even a shred of proof. A political party's attitude toward its own mistakes is one of the most important and surest ways of judging how earnest the party is, and how it fulfills in practice its obligation towards its class and the working people. Frankly acknowledging a mistake, ascertaining the reasons for it, analyzing the conditions that have led up to it, and thrashing out the means of its rectification, that is the hallmark of a serious party. That is how it should perform its duties, and how it should educate and train its class, and then the masses. By failing to fulfill this duty, and give the utmost attention and consideration to the study of their patent error, the lefts in Germany and in Holland have proved that they are not a party of a class, but a circle, not a party of the masses, but a group of intellectualists, and of a few workers, who ape the worst features of intellectualism. Second, in the same pamphlet of the Frankfurt group of lefts, which we have already cited in detail, we read, quote, "The millions of workers who still follow the policy of the center are counter-revolutionary. The rural proletarians provide the legions of counter-revolutionary troops." Unquote. Page 3 of the pamphlet. Everything goes to show that this statement is far too sweeping and exaggerated, but the basic fact set forth here is incontrovertible, and its acknowledgment by the lefts is particularly clear evidence of their mistake. How can one say that parliamentarism is politically obsolete when quote-unquote millions and quote-unquote legions of proletarians are not only still in favor of parliamentarism in general, but are downright counter-revolutionary? It is obvious that parliamentarism in Germany is not yet politically obsolete. It is obvious that the left in Germany have mistaken their desire, their politico-ideological attitude, for objective reality. That is a most dangerous mistake for revolutionaries to make. In Russia, where over a particularly long period, and in particularly varied forms, the most brutal and savage yoke of Tsarism produced revolutionaries of diverse shades, revolutionaries who displayed amazing devotion, enthusiasm, heroism, and willpower. In Russia, we have observed this mistake of the revolutionaries at very close quarters. We have studied it very attentively and have a first-hand knowledge of it. That is why we can also see it especially clearly in others. Parliamentarism is, of course, politically obsolete to the communists in Germany, but, and that is the whole point, we must not regard what is obsolete to us as something obsolete to a class, to the masses. Here again we find that the lefts do not know how to reason, do not know how to act as the party of a class, as the party of the masses. You must not sink to the level of the masses, to the level of the backward strata of the class. That is incontestable. You must tell them the bitter truth. You are in duty bound to call their bourgeois democratic and parliamentary prejudices what they are, prejudices. But at the same time, you must soberly follow the actual state of the class consciousness and preparedness of the entire class, not only of its communist vanguard, and of all the working people, not only of their advanced elements. Even if only a fairly large minority of the industrial workers, and not millions and legions, follow the lead of the Catholic clergy, and a similar minority of rural workers follow the landowners and kulaks, Grossbauern, it undoubtedly signifies that parliamentarism in Germany has not yet politically outlived itself, that participation in parliamentary elections and in the struggle on the parliamentary rostrum is obligatory on the party of the revolutionary proletariat, specifically for the purpose of educating the backward strata of its own class, and for the purpose of awakening and enlightening the undeveloped, downtrodden and ignorant rural masses. Whilst you lack the strength to do away with bourgeois parliaments and every other type of reactionary institution, you must work within them, because it is there that you will still find workers who are duped by the priests and stultified by the conditions of rural life. Otherwise, you risk turning into nothing but windbags. Third, the left communists have a great deal to say in praise of us Bolsheviks. One sometimes feels like telling them to praise us less, and to try to get a better knowledge of the Bolsheviks' tactics. We took part in the elections to the Constituent Assembly, the Russian bourgeois parliament, in September to November 1917. Were our tactics correct or not? If not, then this should be clearly stated and proved, for it is necessary in evolving the correct tactics for international communism. If they were correct, then certain conclusions must be drawn. Of course, there can be no question of placing conditions in Russia on a par with conditions in Western Europe, but as regards the particular question of the meaning of the concept that, quote, parliamentarism has become politically obsolete, unquote, due account should be taken of our experience, for unless concrete experience is taken into account, such concepts very easily turn into empty phrases. In September to November 1917, did we, the Russian Bolsheviks, not have more right than any Western communist to consider that parliamentarism was politically obsolete in Russia? Of course we did, for the point is not whether bourgeois parliaments have existed for a long time or a short time, but how far the masses of the working people are prepared, ideologically, politically and practically, to accept the Soviet system and to dissolve the bourgeois democratic parliament, or allow it to be dissolved. It is an absolutely incontestable and fully established historical fact that in September to November 1917, the urban working class and the soldiers and peasants of Russia were, because of a number of special conditions, exceptionally well prepared to accept the Soviet system and to disband the most democratic of bourgeois parliaments. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks did not boycott the Constituent Assembly, but took part in the elections, both before and after the proletariat conquered political power. That these elections yielded exceedingly valuable, and to the proletariat highly useful, political results has, I make bold to hope, been proved by me in the above-mentioned article, which analyzes in detail the returns of the elections to the Constituent Assembly in Russia. The conclusion which follows from this is absolutely incontrovertible. It has been proved that, far from causing harm to the revolutionary proletariat, participation in a bourgeois democratic parliament, even a few weeks before the victory of a Soviet republic, and even after such a victory, actually helps that proletariat to prove to the backward masses why such parliaments deserve to be done away with. It facilitates their successful dissolution, and helps to make bourgeois parliamentarism politically obsolete. To ignore this experience, while at the same time claiming affiliation to the Communist International, which must work out its tactics internationally, not as narrow or exclusively national tactics, but as international tactics, means committing a gross error and actually abandoning internationalism in deed, while recognizing it in word. Now, let us examine the Dutch left arguments in favor of non-participation in parliaments. The following is the text of thesis number 4, the most important of the above-mentioned Dutch theses. Quote, when the capitalist system of production has broken down, and society is in a state of revolution, parliamentary action gradually loses importance, as compared with the action of the masses themselves. When, in these conditions, Parliament becomes the center and organ of the counter-revolution, whilst, on the other hand, the laboring class builds up the instruments of its power in the Soviets, it may even prove necessary to abstain from all and any participation in parliamentary action. Unquote. The first sentence is obviously wrong, since action by the masses, a big strike for instance, is more important than parliamentary activity at all times, and not only during a revolution or in a revolutionary situation. This obviously untenable and historically and politically incorrect argument merely shows very clearly that the authors completely ignore both the general European experience, the French experience before the revolutions of 1848 and 1870, and the German experience of 1878 to 90, etc., and the Russian experience, see above, of the importance of combining legal and illegal struggle. This question is of immense importance, both in general and in particular, because in all civilized and advanced countries, the time is rapidly approaching when such a combination will more and more become, and has already partly become, mandatory on the party of the revolutionary proletariat, inasmuch as civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is maturing and is imminent, and because of savage persecution of the communists by republican governments and bourgeois governments generally, which resort to any violation of legality. The example of America is edifying enough, etc. The Dutch and the lefts in general have utterly failed to understand this highly important question. The second sentence is, in the first place, historically wrong. We Bolsheviks participated in the most counter-revolutionary parliaments, and experience has shown that this participation was not only useful but indispensable to the party of the revolutionary proletariat. After the first bourgeois revolution in Russia, 1905, so as to pave the way for the second bourgeois revolution, February 1917, and then for the socialist revolution, October 1917. In the second place, this sentence is amazingly illogical. If a parliament becomes an organ and a center, in reality it never has been and never can be a center, but, that is by the way, of counter-revolution, while the workers are building up the instruments of their power in the form of the Soviets, then it follows that the workers must prepare, ideologically, politically and technically, for the struggle of the Soviets against Parliament, for the dispersal of Parliament by the Soviets. But it does not at all follow that this dispersal is hindered or is not facilitated by the presence of a Soviet opposition within the counter-revolutionary Parliament. In the course of our victorious struggle against Denikin and Kolchak, we never found that the existence of a Soviet and proletarian opposition in their camp was immaterial to our victories. We know perfectly well that the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly on January 5, 1918, was not hampered but was actually facilitated by the fact that within the counter-revolutionary Constituent Assembly, which was about to be dispersed, there was a consistent Bolshevik, as well as an inconsistent left socialist revolutionary opposition. The authors of the theses engaged in muddled thinking. They have forgotten the experience of many, if not all, revolutions, which shows the great usefulness during the revolution of a combination of mass action outside a reactionary parliament with an opposition sympathetic to, or better still directly supporting, the revolution within it. The Dutch, and the lefts in general, argue in this respect like doctrinaires of the revolution, who have never taken part in a real revolution, have never given thought to the history of revolutions, or have naively mistaken subjective rejection of a reactionary institution for its actual destruction by the combined operation of a number of objective factors. The surest way of discrediting and damaging a new political, and not only political, idea is to reduce it to an absurdity under these conditions. That is just the kind of disservice the Dutch and German lefts are rendering to the new truth of the Soviet form of government being superior to bourgeois democratic parliaments. Of course, anyone would be in error who voiced the outmoded viewpoint or in general considered it impermissible in all and any circumstances to reject participation in bourgeois parliaments. I cannot attempt here to formulate the conditions under which a boycott is useful, since the object of this pamphlet is far more modest, namely to study Russian experience in connection with certain topical questions of international communist tactics. Russian experience has provided us with one successful and correct instance, 1905, and another one that was incorrect, 1906, of the use of a boycott by the Bolsheviks. Analyzing the first case, we see that we succeeded in preventing a reactionary government from convening a reactionary parliament in a situation in which extra-parliamentary revolutionary action, strikes in particular, was developing at great speed, when not a single section of the proletariat and the peasantry could support the reactionary government in any way, and when the revolutionary proletariat was gaining influence over the backward masses through the strike struggle and through the agrarian movement. It is quite obvious that this experience is not applicable to present-day European conditions. It is likewise quite obvious, and the foregoing arguments bear this out, that the advocacy, even with reservations by the Dutch and the other lefts, of refusal to participate in parliaments is fundamentally wrong and detrimental to the cause of the revolutionary proletariat. In Western Europe and America, parliament has become most odious to the revolutionary vanguard of the working class. That cannot be denied. It can readily be understood, for it is difficult to imagine anything more infamous, vile or treacherous than the behavior of the vast majority of socialists and social democratic parliamentary deputies during and after the war. It would, however, be not only unreasonable but actually criminal to yield to this mood when deciding how this generally recognized evil should be fought. In many countries of Western Europe the revolutionary mood, we might say, is at present a novelty, or a rarity, which has all too long been vainly and impatiently awaited Perhaps that is why people so easily yield to that mood. Certainly, without a revolutionary mood among the masses, and without conditions facilitating the growth of this mood, revolutionary tactics will never develop into action. In Russia, however lengthy, painful, and sanguinary experience has taught us the truth that revolutionary tactics cannot be built on a revolutionary mood alone. Tactics must be based on a sober and strictly objective appraisal of all the class forces in a particular state, and of the states that surround it, and of all the states the world over, as well as of the experience of the revolutionary movements. It is very easy to show one's quote-unquote revolutionary temper merely by hurling abuse at parliamentary opportunism, or merely by repudiating participating in parliaments. Its very ease, however, cannot turn this into a solution of a very difficult problem. It is far more difficult to create a really revolutionary parliamentary group in a European parliament than it was in Russia. That stands to reason. But it is only a particular expression of the general truth that it was easy for Russia, in the specific and historically unique situation of 1917, to start the socialist revolution. But it will be more difficult for Russia than for the European countries to continue the revolution and bring it to its consummation. I had occasion to point this out already at the beginning of 1918, and our experience of the past 2 years has entirely confirmed the correctness of this view. Certain specific conditions, viz. 1. The possibility of linking up the Soviet Revolution with the ending, as a consequence of this revolution, of the imperialist war, which had exhausted the workers and peasants to an incredible degree. 2. The possibility of taking temporary advantage of the mortal conflict between the world's two most powerful groups of imperialist robbers, who were unable to unite against their Soviet enemy. 3. The possibility of enduring a comparatively lengthy civil war, partly owing to the enormous size of the country and to the poor means of communication. 4. The existence of such a profound bourgeois democratic revolutionary movement among the peasantry that the party of the proletariat was able to adopt the revolutionary demands of the peasant party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the majority of whose members were definitely hostile to Bolshevism, and realize them at once, thanks to the conquest of political power by the proletariat. All these specific conditions do not at present exist in Western Europe, and a repetition of such or similar conditions will not occur so easily. Incidentally, apart from a number of other causes, that is why it is more difficult for Western Europe to start a socialist revolution than it was for us. To attempt to circumvent this difficulty by skipping the arduous job of utilizing reactionary parliaments for revolutionary purposes is absolutely childish. You want to create a new society, yet you fear the difficulties involved in forming a good parliamentary group made up of convinced, devoted, and heroic communists in a reactionary parliament? Is that not childish? If Karl Liebknecht in Germany and Zed Höglund in Sweden were able, even without mass support from below, to set examples of the truly revolutionary utilization of reactionary parliaments, why should a rapidly growing revolutionary mass party, in the midst of the post-war disillusionment and embitterment of the masses, be unable to forge a communist group in the worst of the parliaments? It is because in Western Europe the backward masses of the workers, and to an even greater degree of the small peasants, are much more imbued with bourgeois democratic and parliamentary prejudices than they were in Russia. Because of that, it is only from within such institutions as bourgeois parliaments that communists can and must wage a long and persistent struggle, undaunted by any difficulties, to expose, dispel, and overcome these prejudices. The German lefts complain of bad leaders in their party, give way to despair, and even arrive at a ridiculous negation of leaders. But in conditions in which it is often necessary to hide leaders underground, the evolution of good leaders, reliable, tested, and authoritative, is a very difficult matter. These difficulties cannot be successfully overcome without combining legal and illegal work, and without testing the quote-unquote leaders, among other ways, in parliaments. Criticism, the most keen, ruthless, and uncompromising criticism, should be directed not against parliamentarism or parliamentary activities, but against those leaders who are unable, and still more against those who are unwilling, to utilize parliamentary elections and the parliamentary rostrum in a revolutionary and communist manner. Only such criticism, combined of course with the dismissal of incapable leaders and their replacement by capable ones, will constitute useful and fruitful revolutionary work that will simultaneously train the leaders to be worthy of the working class and of all working people, and train the masses to be able properly to understand the political situation and the very often complicated and intricate tasks that spring from that situation. Lenin's footnote. I've had too little opportunity to acquaint myself with left-wing communism in Italy. Comrade Bordiga and his faction of abstentionist communists, Comunista Astensionista, are certainly wrong in advocating non-participation in parliament. But on one point it seems to me Comrade Bordiga is right, as far as can be judged from 2 issues of his paper, Il Soviet, numbers 3 and 4, January 18th and February 1st, 1920. From 4 issues of Comrade Sarati's excellent periodical, Comunismo, numbers 1 through 4, October 1st to November 30th, 1919, and from separate issues of Italian bourgeois papers, which I have seen. Comrade Bordiga and his group are right in attacking Turati and his partisans, who remain in a party which has recognized Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and yet continue their former pernicious and opportunist policy as members of parliament. Of course, in tolerating this, Comrade Sarati and the entire Italian Socialist Party are making a mistake, which threatens to do as much harm and give rise to the same dangers as it did in Hungary, where the Hungarian Turatis sabotaged both the party and the Soviet government from within. Such a mistaken, inconsistent, or spineless attitude towards the opportunist parliamentarians gives rise to the quote-unquote left-wing communism on the one hand, and to a certain extent justifies its existence on the other. Comrade Sarati is obviously wrong when he accuses Deputy Turati of being inconsistent, Comunismo number 3, for it is the Italian Socialist Party itself that is inconsistent in tolerating such opportunist parliamentarians as Turati and company. Footnote. From its foundation in 1892, the Italian Socialist Party saw a bitter ideological struggle between the opportunist and revolutionary trends within it. At the Reggio Emilia Congress of 1912, the most outspoken reformists, who supported the war and collaboration with the government and the bourgeoisie, Ivano Bonomi, Leonida Bisolati and others, were expelled from the party under pressure from the left wing. After the outbreak of the First World War, and prior to Italy's entry into it, the ISP came out against the war and advanced the slogan, "Against war, for neutrality." In December 1914, a group of renegades, including Benito Mussolini, who advocated the bourgeoisie's imperialist policy and supported the war, were expelled from the party. When Italy entered the war on the Entente side, May 1915, 3 distinct trends emerged in the Italian Socialist Party. 1. The right wing, which aided the bourgeoisie in the conduct of the war. 2. The center, which united most of party members and came out under the slogan, "No part in the war and no sabotage of the war." And 3. The left wing, which took a firmer anti-war stand, but could not organize a consistent struggle against the war. The left wing did not realize the necessity of converting the imperialist war into a civil war and of a decisive break with the reformists. After the October Socialist Revolution in Russia, the left wing of the ISP grew stronger, and the 16th Party Congress, held on October 5th to 8 in 1919 in Bologna, adopted a resolution on the affiliation to the Third International. ISP representatives took part in the work of the Second Congress of the Comintern. After the Congress, centrist Sarati, head of the delegation, declared against a break with the reformists. At the 17th Party Congress in Leghorn in January 1921, the centrists, who were in the majority, refused to break with the reformists and to accept all the terms of admission into the Comintern. On January 21st, 1921, the left-wing delegates walked out of the Congress and founded the Communist Party of Italy. Footnote. Hungary. Soviet rule was established in Hungary on March 21st, 1919. The socialist revolution in Hungary was a peaceful one, the Hungarian bourgeoisie being unable to resist the people. Incapable of overcoming its internal and external difficulties, it decided to hand over power for a while to the right-wing Social Democrats, so as to prevent the development of the revolution. However, the Hungarian Communist Party's prestige had grown so great and the demands of rank-and-file Social Democrats for unity with the Communists had become so insistent that the leaders of the Social Democratic Party proposed to the arrested Communist leaders the formation of a joint government. The Social Democratic leaders were obliged to accept the terms advanced by the Communists during the negotiations, that is, formation of a Soviet government, disarmament of the bourgeoisie, the creation of a Red Army and People's Militia, confiscation of the landed estates, the nationalization of industry, an alliance with Soviet Russia, etc. An agreement was simultaneously signed on the merging of the two parties to form the Hungarian Socialist Party. While the two parties were being merged, errors were made which later became clear. The merger was carried out mechanically, without isolation of the reformist elements. At its first meeting, the Revolutionary Government Council adopted a resolution on the formation of the Red Army. On March 26th, the Soviet government of Hungary issued decrees on the nationalization of industrial enterprises, transport and the banks. On April 2nd, a decree was published on the monopoly of foreign trade. Workers' wages were increased by an average of 25%, and an 8-hour working day was introduced. On April 3rd, land reform law was issued, by which all estates exceeding 57 hectares in area were confiscated. The confiscated land, however, was not distributed among the land-starved and landless peasants, but was turned over to agricultural producers' cooperatives and state farms organized after the reform. The poor peasants who had hoped to get land were disappointed. This prevented the establishment of a firm alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry, and weakened Soviet power in Hungary. The Entente imperialists instituted an economic blockade of the Soviet Republic. Armed intervention against the Hungarian Soviet Republic was organized, the advance of interventionist troops stirring up the Hungarian counter-revolutionaries. The treachery of the right-wing Social Democrats, who entered into an alliance with international imperialism, was one of the causes of the Hungarian Soviet Republic's downfall. The unfavorable international situation in the summer of 1919, when Soviet Russia was encircled by enemies and therefore could not help the Hungarian Soviet Republic, also played a definite role. On August 1, 1919, as a result of joint actions by the foreign imperialists, interventionists, and the domestic counter-revolutionaries, Soviet power in Hungary was overthrown. End of footnote. Chapter 8. No compromises?
In the quotation from the Frankfurt pamphlet, we have seen how emphatically the lefts have advanced this slogan. It is sad to see people who no doubt consider themselves Marxists and want to be Marxists forget the fundamental truths of Marxism. This is what Engels, who, like Marx, was one of those rarest of authors whose every sentence in every one of their fundamental works contains a remarkably profound content, wrote in 1874 against the manifesto of the 33 Blankist Communards. Quote, "We are communists, because we want to attain our goal without stopping at intermediate stations, without any compromises, which only postpone the day of victory and prolong the period of slavery." Unquote. Quote, "The German communists are communists because, through all the intermediate stations and all compromises created, not by them, but by the course of historical development, they clearly perceive and constantly pursue the final aim, the abolition of classes and the creation of a society in which there will no longer be private ownership of land or of the means of production. The 33 Blanquists are communists just because they imagine that merely because they want to skip the intermediate stations and compromises, the matter is settled, and if it begins in the next few days, which they take for granted, and they take over power, quote, communism will be introduced, unquote, the day after tomorrow. If that is not immediately possible, they are not communists. What childish innocence it is to present one's own impatience as a theoretically convincing argument. Unquote. Frederick Engels, Program of the Blankist Communards. From the German Social Democratic newspaper Volksstaat, 1874, number 73, given in the Russian translation of articles 1871 to 1875, Petrograd 1919, pages 52 to 53. Footnote. See Marx Engels Works, German edition, Berlin 1962, volume 18, page 533. End of footnote. In the same article, Engels expresses his profound esteem for Lenin and speaks of the unquestionable merit of the latter, who, like Guesti, was one of the most important leaders of international socialism until their betrayal of socialism in August 1914. But Engels does not fail to give a detailed analysis of an obvious error. Of course, to very young and inexperienced revolutionaries, as well as to petty bourgeois revolutionaries of even very respectable age and great experience, it seems extremely, quote-unquote, dangerous, incomprehensible and wrong to, quote-unquote, permit compromises. Many sophists, being unusually or excessively, quote-unquote, experienced politicians, reason exactly the same way as the British leaders of opportunism mentioned by Comrade Lansbury. Quote, if the Bolsheviks are permitted a certain compromise, why should we not be permitted any kind of compromise? Unquote. However, proletarians schooled in numerous strikes, to take only this manifestation of the class struggle, usually assimilate in admirable fashion the very profound truth, philosophical, historical, political, and psychological, expounded by Engels. Every proletarian has been through strikes and has experienced compromises with the hated oppressors and exploiters, when the workers have had to return to work, either without having achieved anything or else agreeing to only a partial satisfaction of their demands. Every proletarian, as a result of the conditions of the mass struggle and the acute intensification of class antagonisms he lives among, sees the difference between a compromise enforced by objective conditions, such as lack of strike funds, no outside support, starvation and exhaustion, a compromise which in no way minimizes the revolutionary devotion and readiness to carry on the struggle on the part of the workers who have agreed to such a compromise, and on the other hand, a compromise by traitors who try to ascribe to objective causes their self-interest. Strikebreakers also enter into compromises. Their cowardice, desire to toady to the capitalists, and readiness to yield to intimidation, sometimes to persuasion, sometimes to sops, and sometimes to flattery from the capitalists. The history of the British labour movement provides a very large number of instances of such treacherous compromises by British trade union leaders, but in one form or another, almost all workers in all countries have witnessed the same sort of thing. Naturally, there are individual cases of exceptional difficulty and complexity when the greatest efforts are necessary for a proper assessment of the actual character of this or that compromise, just as there are cases of homicide when it is by no means easy to establish whether the homicide was fully justified and even necessary, as for example legitimate self-defense, or due to unpardonable negligence, or even to a cunningly executed perfidious plan. Of course, in politics, where it is sometimes a matter of extremely complex relations, national and international, between classes and parties, very many cases will arise that will be much more difficult than the question of a legitimate compromise in a strike, or a treacherous compromise by a strike-breaker, treacherous leader, etc. It would be absurd to formulate a recipe or general rule, no compromises, to suit all cases. One must use one's own brains, and be able to find one's bearings in each particular instance. It is, in fact, one of the functions of a party organization, and of party leaders worthy of the name, to acquire, through the prolonged, persistent, variegated and comprehensive efforts of all thinking representatives of a given class, the knowledge, experience, and, in addition to knowledge and experience, the political flair necessary for the speedy and correct solution of complex political problems. Lenin's footnote. Within every class, even in the conditions prevailing in the most enlightened countries, even within the most advanced class, and even when the circumstances of the moment have aroused all its spiritual forces to an exceptional degree, there always are, and inevitably will be, as long as classes exist, as long as a classless society has not fully consolidated itself, and has not developed on its own foundations, representatives of the class who do not think, and are incapable of thinking for themselves. Capitalism would not be the oppressor of the classes that it actually is, if things were otherwise. End of Lenin's footnote.
Naive and quite inexperienced people imagine that the permissibility of compromise in general is sufficient to obliterate any distinction between opportunism, against which we are waging, and must wage, an unremitting struggle, and revolutionary Marxism or communism. But if such people do not yet know that in nature and society all distinctions are fluid and up to a certain point conventional, nothing can help them but lengthy training, education, enlightenment, and political and everyday experience. In the practical questions that arise in the politics of any particular or specific historical moment, it is important to single out those which display the principal type of intolerable and treacherous compromises, such as embody an opportunism that is fatal to the revolutionary class, and to exert all efforts to explain them and combat them. During the 1914-18 imperialist war between two groups of equally predatory countries, social chauvinism was the principal and fundamental type of opportunism, that is, support of quote-unquote defense of country, which in such a war was really equivalent to defense of the predatory interest of one's own bourgeoisie. After the war, defense of the robber League of Nations, defense of direct or indirect alliances with the bourgeoisie of one's own country against the revolutionary proletariat and the Soviet movement, and defense of bourgeois democracy and bourgeois parliamentarism against Soviet power became the principal manifestation of those intolerable and treacherous compromises whose sum total constituted an opportunism fatal to the revolutionary proletariat and its cause. Footnote. The League of Nations was an international body which existed between the First and the Second World Wars. It was founded in 1919 at the Paris Conference of the victor powers of the First World War. The Covenant of the League of Nations formed part of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 and was signed by 44 nations. The Covenant was designed to produce the impression that this organization's aim was to combat aggression, reduce armaments, and consolidate peace and security. In practice, however, its leaders shielded the aggressors, fostered the arms race and preparations for the Second World War. Between 1920 and 1934, the League's activities were hostile towards the Soviet Union. It was one of the centers for the organizing of armed intervention against the Soviet state in 1920-21. On September 15, 1934, on French initiative, 34 member states invited the Soviet Union to join the League of Nations, which the USSR did, with the aim of strengthening peace. However, the Soviet Union's attempts to form a peace front met with resistance from reactionary circles in the Western powers. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the League's activities came to an end, the formal dissolution taking place in April 1946, according to a decision by the specifically summoned assembly. End of footnote. Quote, all compromise with other parties, any policy of maneuvering and compromise, must be emphatically rejected, unquote. The German lefts write in the Frankfurt pamphlet. It is surprising that, with such views, these lefts do not emphatically condemn Bolshevism. After all, the German lefts cannot but know that the entire history of Bolshevism, both before and after the October Revolution, is full of instances of changes of tack, conciliatory tactics and compromises with other parties, including bourgeois parties. To carry on a war for the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie, a war which is 100 times more difficult, protracted and complex than the most stubborn of ordinary wars between states, and to renounce in advance any change of tack, or any utilization of a conflict of interest, even if temporary, among one's enemies, or any conciliation or compromise with possible allies, even if they are temporary, unstable, vacillating or conditional allies. Is that not ridiculous in the extreme? Is it not like making a difficult ascent of an unexplored and hitherto inaccessible mountain, and refusing in advance ever to move in zigzags, ever to retrace one's steps, or ever to abandon a course once selected, and to try others? And yet, people so immature and inexperienced, if youth were the explanation it would not be so bad, young people are preordained to talk such nonsense for a certain period, have met with support, whether direct or indirect, open or covert, whole or partial, it does not matter, from some members of the Communist Party of Holland. After the first socialist revolution of the proletariat and the overthrow of the bourgeoisie in some country, the proletariat of that country remains for a long time weaker than the bourgeoisie, simply because of the latter's extensive international links, and also because of the spontaneous and continuous restoration and regeneration of capitalism and the bourgeoisie by the small commodity producers of that country, which has overthrown the bourgeoisie. The more powerful enemy can be vanquished only by exerting the utmost effort, and by the most thorough, careful, attentive, skillful, and obligatory use of any, even the smallest rift between the enemies, any conflict of interest among the bourgeoisie of the various countries, and among the various groups or types of bourgeoisie within the various countries, and also by taking advantage of any, even the smallest, opportunity of winning a mass ally, even though this ally is temporary, vacillating, unstable, unreliable, and conditional. Those who do not understand this reveal a failure to understand even the smallest grain of Marxism, of modern scientific socialism in general. Those who do not prove in practice over a fairly considerable period of time, and in fairly varied political situations, their ability to apply this truth in practice, have not yet learned to help the revolutionary class in its struggle to emancipate all toiling humanity from the exploiters, and this applies equally to the period before and after the proletariat has won political power. Our theory is not a dogma, but a guide to action, said Marx and Engels. Footnote. Lenin is referring to a passage from Frederick Engels' letter to F.A. Sorge of November 29, 1886, in which, criticizing German Social Democrat political exiles living in America, Engels wrote that for them the theory was a credo, not a guide to action. See Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, Selected Correspondence, Moscow, 1956, page 395. End of footnote. The greatest blunder, the greatest crime, committed by such quote-unquote out-and-out Marxists as Karl Kautsky, Otto Bauer, etc., is that they have not understood this and have been unable to apply it at crucial moments of the proletarian revolution. Political activity is not like the pavement of Nevsky Prospect, the well-kept, broad and level pavement of the perfectly straight principal thoroughfare of St. Petersburg. N.G. Chernyshevsky, the great Russian socialist of the pre-Marxist period, used to say. Since Chernyshevsky's time, disregard or forgetfulness of this truth has cost Russian revolutionaries countless sacrifices. We must strive at all cost to prevent the left communists and West European and American revolutionaries that are devoted to the working class from paying as dearly as the backward Russians did to learn this truth. Prior to the downfall of Tsarism, the Russian Revolutionary Social Democrats made repeated use of the services of the bourgeois liberals. That is, they concluded numerous practical compromises with the latter. In 1901 to 1902, even prior to the appearance of Bolshevism, the old editorial board of Iskra, consisting of Plekhanov, Axelrod, Zasulich, Martov, Patrusov, and myself, concluded, not for long it is true, a formal political alliance with Struve, the political leader of bourgeois liberalism, while at the same time being able to wage an unremitting and most merciless ideological and political struggle against bourgeois liberalism and against the slightest manifestation of its influence in the working class movement. The Bolsheviks have always adhered to this policy. Since 1905, they have sympathetically advocated an alliance between the working class and the peasantry against the liberal bourgeoisie and Tsarism, never, however, refusing to support the bourgeoisie against Tsarism, for instance, during the second rounds of elections, or during second ballots, and never ceasing their relentless ideological and political struggle against the socialist revolutionaries, the bourgeois revolutionary peasant party, exposing them as petty bourgeois democrats, who have falsely described themselves as socialists. During the Duma elections of 1907, the Bolsheviks entered briefly into a formal political bloc with the socialist revolutionaries. Between 1903 and 1912, there were periods of several years in which we were formally united with the Mensheviks in a single social democratic party. But we never stopped our ideological and political struggle against them as opportunists and vehicles of bourgeois influence on the proletariat. During the war, we concluded certain compromises with the Kautskyites, with the left Mensheviks, in parentheses Mardov, and with a section of the socialist revolutionaries, in parentheses Chernov and Natanson. We were together with them at Zimmerwald and Kienthal, and issued joint manifestos. Footnote. The reference is to the International Socialist Conferences in Zimmerwald and Kienthal, Switzerland. The Zimmerwald Conference, the first international socialist conference, was held on September 5th to 8th, 1915. The Kienthal Conference, the second international socialist conference, was held in the small town of Kienthal on April 24th to 30, 1916. The Zimmerwald and Kienthal conferences contributed to the ideological unity, on the basis of Marxism-Leninism, of the left-wing elements in West European social democracy, who later played an active part in the formation of communist parties in their countries and the establishment of the Third Communist International. However, we never ceased and never relaxed our ideological and political struggle against the Kautskyites, Martov and Chernov. When Natanson died in 1919, a revolutionary communist Narodnik, he was very close to us and almost in agreement with us.